In this video, I aim to do three things. The first is that I hope to articulate the unique fantasy I think the original Mass Effect trilogy struggled to deliver. The second thing I'm going to do is propose a redesign of Mass Effect 1 and 2's alignment system that would help Mass Effect 3 better achieve this fantasy I specify. Third, hopefully I'm maybe going to give you and me some more emotional closure about the Mass Effect trilogy. I think the stakes here are higher than just emotional closure, though. I actually think that the future Mass Effect-inspired games are likely to disappoint in the ways that Mass Effect 3 and Mass Effect Andromeda did if they don't try to offer the right fantasy and the right redesign. So, if you're looking for some more closure about Mass Effect, maybe you want better games inspired by the Mass Effect franchise in the future, or you have an interest in narrative design in video games, watch on, dear viewer. Who am I? Professionally, I've got a day job in market research and a master's degree in philosophy. Personally, I am a hyper-focusing goofball who enjoys analyzing stories and games. Historically, I played Mass Effect 1 and 2 dozens of times when I was much younger than I am now. I was emotionally devastated by Mass Effect 3 in high school. It was rough. Years after that, after I finished undergrad, I was shocked by how little I cared for Mass Effect Andromeda when it came out. I didn't enjoy it, I didn't love it, I didn't hate it. It just felt like I was playing a generic AAA sci-fi RPG, not my beloved Mass Effect. Most recently, when Mass Effect Legendary Edition came out, it was a mixed bag. It was definitely fun to return to the trilogy, but it was really frustrating to see that so many old talking points about this franchise were still being repeated, as if really nothing had been learned about what actually went wrong with the Mass Effect franchise, and how it could aspire to a better future while still keeping the essence of the intellectual property intact. So, this video is my attempt to start a conversation that can hopefully move us in that direction. I've spent a decade stewing on Mass Effect. It's among my greatest pop culture interests. I've researched the design of alignments and documented their problems in more detail than anyone else I can find at time of recording. I've scoured the Internet Archive and Wayback Machine for stuff you can't even find in a Google search anymore. Stuff that not even the Mass Effect YouTubers seem to even be aware of just yet. And I've been tightening up the script for this video that I'm performing from right now for a year. So, fear not, this video's length, I have actually cut the fat. I'm not a rambler, I just don't offer critiques without solutions, or solutions that are half-assed. I offer full-ass solutions, which may be totally incorrect, but will prove thought-provoking. So, if you appreciate this video, I'd encourage you to consider supporting my Patreon. Long-form essays like this take me months to research, write, edit, film, mix, etc. I expect this to be demonetized because I use clips from, movies to make certain points where it's relevant. And it would really just be much easier to invest in raising the quality of videos like this with more direct support. Indeed, my next video, I'm going to be using the redesign I propose in this one to rewrite all of Mass Effect 3. And if you'd like to offer feedback on that work in progress, fill out the survey in the description. But with all that, stuff out of the way, let's actually get into why you're here. Let's get started. Let's dive into exactly what I think Mass Effect was arguably trying to do as a game. So, when you think of the Mass Effect franchise at its very best, firing on all cylinders, what do you think the games were trying to achieve? What makes this franchise unique as an IP relative to other AAA RPGs? I think the unique fantasy Mass Effect tried and failed to reliably offer is like a mixture of design ideas that we can see in Star Wars: Knights of the Old Republic and The Witcher 3: Wild Hunt. A unique combination of role-playing driven by both moral clarity and moral ambiguity. KOTOR's influence on Mass Effect is well known and obvious in multiple design areas, but The Witcher 3 came out several years after Mass Effect 3. Nonetheless, I think The Witcher 3 is a good example of the kind of RPG that the trilogy tried to be, even if it couldn't have been a direct influence. Indeed, this is probably why Bioware claimed that Mass Effect Andromeda was inspired by The Witcher 3. The Witcher 3 did a great job with some design ideas that Bioware themselves recognized were core to the Mass Effect IP. So, given all that, what exactly do KOTOR and The Witcher 3 do particularly well as RPGs? How do they differ from each other? How can we recognize them in the design of the Mass Effect games? In Bioware's 2003 Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, which I'm going to call KOTOR from here on out, you make big and small alignment choices all throughout the game that are explicitly good on the light side and evil on the dark side. The upshot to this design is that players get a powerful sense of authorial control of the moral of the story. There's a profound sense of moral clarity you get playing this game. And of course the downside here is that you're never really going to feel the need to be thinking about what is virtuous or vicious. The game is doing all that thinking for you. Now, if you think about CD Projekt Red's 2015 The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt, which I'm just going to call The Witcher 3 going forwards, in that game, you make a potpourri of ethically nuanced choices. The game is aiming to make you feel like there's no universal principles relevant to the main story and all the side quests. And the upshot to this design is that players, they get the gratifying feeling that they're getting wiser as they morally reason about different ethical dilemmas that you have to decide and think about what is right. There's this profound sense of moral ambiguity, which can be quite empowering. Of course, the natural downside here is that you're never really going to feel like you have a powerful sense of authorial control over the moral of the story. Obviously, these two fantasies, from The Witcher 3, from KOTOR, they're very different. KOTOR is about good and evil, and The Witcher 3, the marketing for this game, it's marketed as being beyond good and evil. It's very Nietzsche. So you got one game here inviting you to decide the moral of the story, and the other is rejecting the notion that there is any simple moral to take away from the story. One game here, it's always giving you two options, and the other game, it's always giving you multiple options. And so on a surface level, it seems like these games have nothing in common. The fantasies that they offer for a player are totally incompatible, and they have very different strengths and weaknesses. The thing is, it's a bit of an optical illusion. Parts of these fantasies are compatible. In theory, you could boldly design a sci-fi RPG focused on alignment choices, which never offers morally obvious good and evil dilemmas. A game which makes you feel wiser and like you chose the moral of the story. You need to walk a very fine design tightrope to combine these different fantasies, but you could do it. It would be ambitious as hell. But the result, even if you didn't fully live up to the promise here, it would be remarkable. And I think, this is arguably the premise of the Mass Effect trilogy. At its best, the Mass Effect trilogy offered this fantasy. The fantasy of dictating the moral of the story, which isn't about good and evil, combined with the fantasy of becoming wiser by deliberating over nuanced moral dilemmas. In other words, it seems like the trilogy was trying to give players agency over the moral of the story via alignments like KOTOR, but it was doing that with choices that would ideally feel nuanced, like those in The Witcher 3. I'm going to show you what I think would need to change about Mass Effect 1 and 2's alignment mechanics to make for a version of Mass Effect 3 that reliably lives up to this unique target fantasy. Because this unique fantasy was unevenly offered throughout the games. All too often, Mass Effect, it feels like a shotgun wedding, a bad mix of KOTOR and The Witcher 3, a mixture which is combining the worst parts of both of their fantasies rather than their unique strengths. You see, Mass Effect 1 and 2, it usually feels way too much like KOTOR, a game that's focused on moral clarity. You definitely feel that you're deciding the moral of the story, hip hip hooray for that, but you hardly feel like you're getting wiser. There's virtually no need to ever consider what is good or evil in these games. Moral ambiguity is not really present. Mass Effect 3 and Andromeda, though, they're on the other side of the spectrum of Mass Effect 1 and 2. Mass Effect 3 and Andromeda feel way too much like The Witcher 3, a game which prioritizes moral ambiguity. You feel like you're getting wiser, that's for certain, but you're hardly going to feel like you're authoring the moral and the meaning of the story. You know, there's no predictable types of ethical alignment dilemmas which are the focus of your role-playing. If you think about it, like, there's not actually any single Mass Effect out of all the 4 mainline entries which has managed to strike a reliable balance between the design ideas that we can recognize in KOTOR and the design ideas in The Witcher 3. There's like a fundamental sense in which this franchise has never actually lived up to its very unique potential. Now, if you're someone who liked how Mass Effect 3 handled alignments, or, you love how Mass Effect Andromeda eliminated them from gameplay, you're probably wondering why I want to return to an alignment-based design and tinker with what Mass Effect 1 and 2 were doing to create an improved Mass Effect 3. And that's a fair point, and I think that's because Mass Effect 3 actually definitely did do some things right, which has tended to conceal all the things it did wrong. Mass Effect 3, it was great how it loosened the restrictions on alignments and made it a little easier to decide what you wanted to do Paragon or Renegade-wise. And it was a great choice to let more of your squad mates oppose you over key alignment choices. The most memorable parts of Mass Effect 3 is definitely how Rex, Morden, Tali, or Legion can die as a direct result of certain key choices you make. I mean, that is great stuff. Huge tectonic changes to the alignment system that really, love it. The thing is, though, that's not all that Mass Effect 3 changed about the alignment mechanics. So it's a well-known truism among the Mass Effect fanbase that Bioware had a tendency to overreact to fan feedback. As much as they would sometimes, really get things right when they would iterate between games, they often had a tendency to prefer big swings over smaller tweaks. See the evolving design of inventory, planet scanning, the Mako, Hammerhead, and so on. But the thing here is, given this tendency to prefer big changes over small ones, it's really not surprising that Bioware seems to have overreacted to the criticism of Mass Effect 1 and 2's alignment mechanics. In a press release for Mass Effect 3, series writer Patrick Weeks explicitly calls out how one thing that the changes are going to do is make it so that you feel like you're, quote-unquote, never the villain in Mass Effect 3. There was this very deliberate attempt with Mass Effect 3 to make it so that it wouldn't feel like a game about choosing to be good or evil like KOTOR. Mass Effect 3 really tried to achieve this by moving away from alignment choices. Your role-playing choices in that game revolve around morally ambiguous war assets. I've explored the issues with this change in extraordinary detail elsewhere, but to sum up the problem here briefly, the change to war assets and away from alignments is a problem because Mass Effect 1 and 2 didn't set up story beats about war assets. They set up story beats about alignments. So Mass Effect 3 was a design recipe for a controversial ending to the trilogy, regardless of the writing team involved. Unless you want to guarantee disappointment, don't do something new in the third act of a story that the first and second act didn't set up. Moving towards war assets and away from alignments is arguably why Mass Effect 3 has an infamous reputation. Mass Effect 3 tried to be far more like The Witcher 3 and far less like KOTOR. And this design choice is arguably why it has such an uneven reputation, souring the franchise's legacy. That move in some ways made some things better, but in deeply fundamental ways, it removed a core part of what makes Mass Effect Mass Effect. And unfortunately, Bioware seems like they overreacted to the unanimous praise directed at Mass Effect 3's changes to alignments. When it came time for Mass Effect Andromeda to reboot the franchise, it cut alignments, and it doubled down on a war asset style mechanic, and it openly modeled its quest design on The Witcher 3, like moral ambiguity, false steam all the way, goodbye moral clarity. That's why, Andromeda has viability mechanics, this number that you're pushing up all the way like war assets, which all your choices ultimately revolve around. It's why Andromeda doesn't have any alignment mechanics, and it's why Andromeda has a potpourri of small quests that are all disconnected to each other, they don't share common ethical through lines, and there's no sense that you're deeply shaping the moral of the story here. All of this with Andromeda, it's just a logical next step if you think that Mass Effect 3 made a good design choice in promoting war asset mechanics to the center of roleplay rather than moral alignment choices. If you liked the aggressive shift towards moral ambiguity and away from moral clarity, Andromeda is just doubling down on that move. Andromeda is what happens when you try to make Mass Effect The Witcher 3 without anything from KOTOR. And this means you gotta say goodbye to the feeling that you get to author the moral of the story, and you can say hello to a lot of choices that feel unimportant. Maybe you feel like you're getting wiser making them, but the stakes are totally different now. To be fair, I don't hate Andromeda. I think parts of it actually outshine the original trilogy. Like, your crewmates, they often get to move around the Tempest in Andromeda. And the thing is, though, Mass Effect 3 actually implemented that idea first. It just doesn't do it a lot, probably because of the rushed development for that game. And Andromeda, to its credit, wow, it is actually so much fun to see your crewmates going around, because they're like, oh, they're like people. They don't just stand in one part and do their calibrations. And so I would love it if, Mass Effect takes design ideas like that from Andromeda in the future. And there's other things I could probably go on about at length, but all of these are small potatoes. I think that Andromeda is rightly seen as a misstep that's threatened the franchise. It's a generic sci-fi RPG at worst if you're feeling uncharitable, and it's a discount version of peak Mass Effect at best if you're feeling generous. And that's because Mass Effect Andromeda, it's not trying to offer the fantasy the older games did. Andromeda, it's trying to be The Witcher 3 without any key elements from KOTOR. It's not trying to balance the moral clarity of KOTOR's alignments and the moral ambiguity of The Witcher 3. And in choosing to reject an attempt at even finding a balance here, I do think that's just a betrayal of the most universally praised entries in the franchise, which are Mass Effect 1 and 2. Those games, they were trying to find a balance that we can find in the design ideas of The Witcher 3 and KOTOR, even if they really struggled to hit that balance and tended to be far more like KOTOR. These games are definitely flawed, but they're influential classics because they're such a unique sum of their parts. And that's why I think that if you think, as many seem to these days, that the Mass Effect franchise has lost its way, I think that's arguably because Mass Effect is shunning its old target fantasy. Mass Effect 3 prioritized war assets and moral ambiguity over alignments and moral clarity, and then Andromeda doubled down in this design direction by fully cutting alignments. And that's too much moral ambiguity at the expense of the moral clarity that lets us shape the story's meaning. You've eliminated one of the two key elements that makes Mass Effect feel unique compared to all the other AAA RPGs out there. It's so easy for AAA RPGs to either be all about moral clarity or all about moral ambiguity, but to find a productive synthesis of the two, that's something that only Mass Effect, when it was at its very best, ever did. And yeah, there were definitely flaws with Mass Effect 1 and 2's alignment mechanics. I go into that problem at detail in this video. But the thing is, Mass Effect 3 and Andromeda threw the baby out with the bathwater when they were trying to fix the problems with Mass Effect 1 and 2. They play just way too much like The Witcher 3. So, I think that if you approach it from this angle, the franchise, the wider Mass Effect franchise, is in great danger of suffering a very predictable and frankly well-deserved death if it keeps overreacting to feedback and, trying to please everyone, chasing wider industry trends rather than focusing on what it does well that none of its competitors do well. So I think to survive and thrive, Mass Effect needs to embrace what it can uniquely do well, what it has done well, and what few others have dared to try and do. Mass Effect should try to balance KOTOR and The Witcher 3 with redesigned alignment mechanics. Any player of Mass Effect 1 and 2 can likely agree with the idea the alignment system is flawed, even if they are unlikely to agree about what the flaws are and what exactly is causing them to happen. But what does it even mean to play as a Paragon or Renegade to begin with? The natural place to start is to see what the games themselves explicitly say, and then what Bioware creatives say as well. I found it surprising to learn Bioware never gave a canon in-game definition of what it means to be a Paragon or Renegade. The words themselves imply that a Paragon is a moral exemplar of some type, and the Renegade is an outlaw of some variety. But even though Mass Effect 1 and 2 revolve around these alignments and demand you play into them, no actual definitions of these words are ever offered. There are hints, to be sure, but not much that I would say is particularly detailed. For example, all Mass Effect 1 reveals is that Paragons have the Charm talent, and Renegades have the Intimidate talent. At the most, that suggests these alignments are a type of conversational or conflict resolution move. Mass Effect 2 is even vaguer. One random loading screen tip claims a Renegade is a badass and a Paragon is a hero. Super specific, that. Bioware, there are many types of heroes. Classical heroes, romantic heroes, tragic heroes, and so on. And one person's badass is another person's buffoon. So all this badass versus hero distinction suggests is that you are playing into some archetypical kind of character, but it doesn't really tell you what kind you're playing. If you don't tell me what you mean by badass and hero, you don't actually tell me anything about alignments. Probably the biggest in-game hint we can find is in Mass Effect 2. It hides in an easily missed email from the Ceres Ice brandy lover and Normandy physician, Dr. Karen Chakwas. In short, Dr. Chakwas is telling us in this email that our new facial scars are a mind-over-matter medical situation. Our mental outlook, that is our alignment, affects their growth and decay over time. Negative or aggressive renegade acts create increasingly vibrant scars on our ugly mug. On the other hand, positive, peaceful, or compassionate Paragon acts will make us look unblemished once again. In other words, Dr. Chocolates here is implying that we should see alignments as a general moral disposition, a habitual attitude about how we relate to other people. Renegades generally have a selfish and aggressive grind set, while Paragons are generally very other-regarding and have a more peaceful vibe. And while this isn't said outright here, it very much looks like Bioware wants us to see the Renegade as inhuman or straight-up evil. I can't help but think of a similar mechanic in Metal Gear Solid 5, The Phantom Pain. Oh god, I love that game. In that game, you get demon points for aggressive and selfish actions like killing enough people or building a nuclear weapon. You can also get heroism points for compassionate and other-regarding actions. Stuff like non-lethal takedowns, animal life rescue, or disposing of nuclear weapons. With enough demon points, you sprout a perpetually bloody metallic horn out of the top of your frickin' head. If you have enough heroism points, your horn almost entirely recedes, you can barely see it, and you're not perpetually covered in blood anymore. In other words, the game isn't interested in making you reflect over moral dilemmas, like say in The Witcher 3. It wants you to dislike killing and nuclear weapons, full stop. Very Kojima. The game lets you know that this is its opinion on morality by warping your physical appearance. Unambiguously, we are supposed to see one way of playing this game as good, and the other way as evil. And we've seen Bioware use this design in KOTOR as well. In that game, dark side choices make you look unnatural and super edgy, while light side choices give you a sort of beautiful little aura and otherwise don't affect your appearance. Given the fact that Bioware has used this mechanic in KOTOR, and the fact that it's actually very common in other games and stories, the facial scars in Mass Effect 2 imply that Paragons are good guys and Renegades are evil bastards. This is a very old and influential idea, namely the idea that physical deformity reveals a flawed moral character. And at least so far as I can tell, this is all you can find inside the games themselves defining alignments. To summarize all that we've just seen, according to the games, alignments are a style of conversational move, a good or evil mental disposition, and some kind of awkwardly defined character archetype. All these three things have been kludged together, which is a mess. Surely Bioware wasn't so naive as to think that all heroes are charming and look unblemished, while all badasses are intimidating and look physically deformed? What was Bioware thinking? To understand Bioware's artistic intentions, I've read or listened to every interview I could find that even tangentially covers the subject of how Bioware internally defined Paragon and Renegade gameplay. The end result of this exhaustive search was a painful conclusion. It looks like Bioware never sat down and hashed out exactly what defined Paragons and Renegades. There's a notable lack of internal consensus at Bioware once you start digging on this subject. The logical place to start is with Casey Hudson, the project director for the Mass Effect trilogy, the guy who pitched the concept of Mass Effect to Bioware's co-founders, Dr. Ray Muzyka and Dr. Greg Zaschuk.
So how did Mass Effect start?
It's funny, again, just recently talking to Greg Zaschuk about that, and he was like, yeah, it was basically him, Ray, and Casey at a Greek restaurant here in Edmonton. Edmonton, Alberta, Canada.
Amazing.
One of those sort of like, we want to make a space opera. Let's do it. And, of course, KOTOR had come out and lessons learned there. But I think, wanting to also work on their own title and create their own sort of world from that.
Well, we finished Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic around mid-2003. And then we did the PC version. But through the last half of 2003, we were starting to really think about what we wanted to do next. And in general, we wanted to take what we had done with Knights of the Old Republic, which was a huge space adventure. You go to a lot of different planets, and it's in the Star Wars universe, so you've got just a good basis for adventure and combat and things like that. And we wanted to take the formula that we brought to that kind of role-playing game experience, where you can create a character, be who you want to be, and really develop that character over the course of a game. And take that into a new universe where there was really no limits on what you could do as a character and what we could do with the story. And so that meant basically coming up with our own intellectual property, our own galaxy.
So we would expect Hudson to understand the difference between alignments, because it's no exaggeration to say that the original premise of Mass Effect seems to be his brainchild. In a Mass Effect 2 era interview by G4, which you can only find on the Internet Archive today, Casey Hudson briefly defined Paragon and Renegade role-playing and their new interrupts.
I think that's one of the things that's different about the way we approach it in the Mass Effect series, is that it's not about whether you are someone who is good or evil, or even that the concepts are good and evil. It's actually more about there's obviously something you have to do. You have to survive. You have to find a way for you and the rest of humanity to survive this arcing threat in the whole series. But it's more about how you go about that. Are you ruthless? Do you care about other people? Are you trying to find the way that is, maybe a sacrifice for you, but more generous to other people? But the difference is that it's not whether it's one or the other. It's the total accumulation of both sides. I think that's more real to the way just life works. Any given person has done good things and bad things, and it becomes part of your reputation. That's reflected in your Renegade and Paragon scores. The way the interrupt system works is it either gives you a Paragon or a Renegade interrupt. Most conversations have one or the other. There are times, however, where it can actually loop from one to the other. So that's part of, I think, using the interrupt system as a role player, is to if you're saying, no, I'm a good guy, I'm a Paragon type player, then you see the Renegade interrupt and you say, no, I can't do that. I'm not gonna see the bad guy with his back to me and pick up a welding torch and do whatever happens next, So you may say, I'm gonna let that opportunity pass. It's like a nasty thought that enters your head that you say, no, I can't do that.
So, to summarize what we just heard from Hudson, he thinks that Paragons are not good and Renegades are not evil. They are different role-playing paths ensuring the survival of humanity against the Reapers. More specifically, the Paragon is willing to make self-sacrifices to generously serve others, while the Renegade is far more comparatively ruthless. At the same time, Paragon and Renegade scores are tracked independently, unlike in KOTOR, where making one alignment choice reduces your points in the other alignment. Mass Effect's more flexible approach to alignment is meant to make the games feel more true to ethical choice in the real world. All that being said, though, Hudson also thinks that good actions are reflected in Paragon points and bad actions are reflected in Renegade points. And we can even see Renegade interrupts as nasty thoughts that might enter our head and which we might choose to act on. So this interview, if you think about it, it's strange because Hudson almost straight up contradicts himself. He starts by denying that Paragons are good and that Renegades are evil, but less than 1 minute later, he also says offhand that one alignment is good and the other is bad. What? I mean, I suppose you could argue there's a difference between good versus evil and good versus bad, but beats me what difference there is. It ultimately looks like what Hudson is saying here implies that Mass Effect is something like KOTOR with its alignments, but it's also trying to differentiate itself by aiming at something like the realistic nuance we can find, say, in A Witcher 3. But nonetheless, his understanding of alignment still collapses effectively into good versus evil. Now, if this was only one person at Bioware who sounded so confused about Mass Effect's alignments, I think it's safe to say we could ignore it and not read too much into it. It wouldn't be odd if Casey Hudson just put his foot in his mouth in this interview. We all make verbal fumbles. I'm definitely making them all the time during recording this, and I'm happy that I get to cut them all out. But the thing is, if we look at what other people at Bioware, what other developers understood alignments to be, we find the same sort of dynamic we just saw with Hudson. Things don't get any less confusing. There's a documentary on the making of Mass Effect 2 that illustrates Bioware's internal lack of consensus on how to define Paragons and Renegades against each other. Now, I'm going to play it for you and try and pay attention to the vague, somewhat similar, but not meaningfully consistent definitions that you see in this documentary.
Commander Shepard is, of course, a hard-bitten, ruthless individual.
She'll do whatever has to be done to do the right thing.
Perhaps he's a kind-hearted, nice individual who helps people out.
They can play the characters a lot darker and have a lot more darker experience, or they can play it a lot more Paragon, and they can shape the story as they want.
You got to make the decision when you're playing a game like this at some certain points. Do I really make the decision to be nice to everybody?
How are you going to play? Are you going to let people die, or are you going to try to do everything you can and to keep them alive?
And at any one time, you're faced with a lot of different things you can do, but then you really get a focus moment when you have to decide who lives and dies.
Little choices here and there, and it changes everything.
They're morally challenging choices. You can be Paragon or Renegade, but they're going to have outcomes, and you're going to have to live with the consequences of your actions.
That was a lot of people and definitions of Paragon and Renegade gameplay. Too many, really. So I've broken these remarks down in order of appearance in a chart for easy reference. I'll go through each person's remarks now one by one so we can see the nuances and lack thereof. Please forgive me if I butcher the pronunciation of some of these names. I looked it up, and I'm going to do my best, but I'm not super familiar with them. Well, at least saying them. So first we start with Mark Meer, the voice actor for Male Shepard. Meer thinks Paragon choices come from a kind-hearted, nice person who is motivated to help people out, while a Renegade is a hard-bitten and ruthless individual, presumably less interested in helping people. Next, we have Jennifer Hale, the voice actor for Female Shepard. It's not clear if Hale is talking about one alignment or the other, or even both at the same time. But on the subject of alignments, Hale claims Shepard is the kind of person who does whatever they have to do the right thing. Afterwards, we meet the impressively mustachioed Parrish Lee. That mustache is something, man. So Parrish Lee was Mass Effect 2's lead cinematic animator. Parrish Lee claims that Renegade gameplay is dark. It's a darker experience. And that's all he says, which presumably implies that Paragon gameplay is light and a lighter experience. And if this wasn't a Mass Effect 2 documentary, you'd be forgiven for assuming that Lee is talking about KOTOR. After all, you make alignment choices between the light and dark side in that other Bioware RPG. Then we encounter the zebra-striped shirt Chris Borders, Mass Effect 2's voiceover director. Borders' job title implies that he directs people like Jennifer Hale and Mark Meer when they give their performances. So that means you'd expect him to be able to say more than Meer or Hale about what it means to deliver a Paragon or Renegade line. But we don't actually get much more from Borders. Borders defines alignments in a similar way, but it's even more reductive. He thinks that a Paragon is someone who decides to be nice to everybody. The Renegade differs because they are willing to not always be nice to everybody, all the time, no matter what, I guess. This doesn't really seem like the profound difference that he acts like it is. At this point, we bump into Mac Walters, who is credited as the Mass Effect 2 lead writer. Before we recap what he says, I want to say straight up that I disavow anyone dunking on Mac Walters. Walters is often scapegoated by conspiratorial and disappointed Mass Effect fans who are looking for a singular villain to blame for the Mass Effect 3 controversy. But the thing is, such a critical assessment of Mac Walters is not just unfair and untrue, it's just a very reductive way to try and analyze Mass Effect, because no one person matters that much in something like the production of a AAA video game. It takes a village to make or break something like Mass Effect. Now, returning to our point here, what Walter says about alignments is actually one of the most useful things in this documentary. Walter says that renegades let people die. The Paragon differs because they do everything they can to keep people alive. That's it. Walter's take may seem simplistic, but in practice, as we will see later, Walters is on the money here. Next, we cut to no less than a co-founder of Bioware, Dr. Greg Zaschuk, who echoes what Jennifer Hale and Mac Walters said. Zaschuk implies that alignment choices are moments where the story focuses on who the player wants to live or die. Again, that's it. Is Zaschuk's point that different alignments let different people die, or live, or something else entirely? Who knows? As we wrap up, we get the lovely Brandon Keener, the voice actor of Garrus Vicarian. Given how Garrus is the squadmate who can most dynamically act more like a Paragon or Renegade across the games, it's also a surprise that Keener has so little insight to offer us on this subject. In fact, Keener has the least to say in this documentary. Very quietly, he says that there are little choices that change everything. And in this sense, Keener is a lot like Zaschuk. It's not clear if he's talking about Paragons or Renegades, or about them both at once. And our last opinion on this matter is another Bioware co-founder, Dr. Ray Muzyka. Muzyka defines both Paragon and Renegade choices as morally challenging choices with different outcomes. Muzyka unhelpfully fails to define the differences between Paragons and Renegades, which he references. He doesn't say what makes these choices challenging either. In short, all Muzyka effectively says is that Paragon and Renegade choices are, wait for it, different choices. So even just looking at this one documentary, it's not clear that Bioware had a robust internal consensus about what it meant to play as a Paragon or as a Renegade. It sometimes even seems like they're improvising their own definitions on the spot, hoping that you won't notice that's what they're doing. This level of confusion and contradiction is remarkable for Bioware, because in a documentary for the making of Mass Effect 1, then lead writer Drew Karpyshyn notes Bioware emphasized coordination between the programmers, artists, animators, and everyone on the project, so that everyone understood what the final product would be when the game was completed.
When we write something at Bioware, there's usually 3-4 writers on any given time working together on a project, maybe 6-7 writers across the whole life of the project. We also take input from all the other people on the project. You know, the artists help you understand what the vision of the game is going to be. The programmers give you an understanding of what the gameplay is going to be. Your character artists show you the characters you're writing for. You see them coming to life. The animators make them real. And everybody has an understanding of what we want the final product to be.
Now, it's possible that this culture that Karpyshyn is describing went away over time, but assuming that Bioware tried to maintain this emphasis on cross-disciplinary communication and shared understanding while making the trilogy, Bioware's lack of consensus on Paragons and Renegades calls even more attention to itself. You know, if we just think about everything we've just seen, the closest thing to a consensus in all the remarks is that Paragons are like good lifesavers and Renegades are like evil sociopaths who kind of like to kill people. This idea, it definitely tracks with what we've seen the game indicate with the facial mascara mechanics in Mass Effect 2, and it's definitely a fantasy that is in keeping with Bioware's KOTOR, that's for damn sure. But if KOTOR's version of alignments, that Manichean good versus evil vibe, if that were truly Bioware's aim, why does Casey Hudson think what he does? And why does another writer who was on the entire trilogy, Patrick Weeks, also feel certain that Bioware never intended the difference between alignments to be one of good versus evil?
We never really meant for Paragon or Renegade to be good guy versus bad guy, but rightly or wrongly, whatever we intended, people really felt like Paragon was good guy and Renegade was bad guy.
Mm-hmm. At this point, I don't see how you can escape the conclusion that Bioware didn't sit down and reach an internal agreement about what defined Paragons and Renegades. And that's wild. I mean, think about that, because this difference is essential to the core gameplay loop in Mass Effect. So, somewhat astonishingly, everybody seems to act like everybody else has mostly the same opinion on alignments as they do. But as we've seen, if you find one Bioware creative with an opinion, you can find another one with a different take on things. The left hand doesn't really seem to know what the right hand is doing over at Bioware. Bioware seems to be at odds with itself, and they don't even seem to recognize that. So if we zoom back here, I think a question that's helpful to ask is, was their goal to do KOTOR again with the Manichean-style alignments of good versus evil? Or were they trying to do a more complex ethical fantasy, something like we see in The Witcher? Because it really looks like we have a mixture of both these things in practice. But if one of these was the intended goal, which one was it? Like, what's the accident here and what was the plan? Personally, I suspect the Bioware creative who is the closest to capturing what their original intent was for alignments is Chris Latois. Chris Latois was a writer for Mass Effect 1 and 2, who was responsible for writing all of Mass Effect 1's delightful codex entries. Latois was the lore master before Chris Hepler took over that role for Mass Effect 2 and 3. So, quite literally, Latois has an encyclopedic knowledge of Mass Effect 1's lore. Therefore, it's not surprising that Latois has a similarly thorough articulation of what he thinks Bioware's original intent was with alignments. Latois' definition of alignments is refreshingly specific after the mess of words we just waded through. Here's what Latois has to say. The archetypes we were told to follow for Shepard's dialogue were Captain Kirk of Star Trek for Paragon and Jack Bauer of 24 for Renegade. Kirk always takes a morally upright path and somehow makes it all work out, even if that requires reprogramming the Kobayashi Maru simulator. Jack Bauer does morally questionable things because he knows there is no other choice to save lives. In other words, Chris Latois thinks Bioware originally aimed to define their alignment mechanic with a Captain Kirk versus Jack Bauer binary. This goes a long way towards explaining why so many people at Bioware thought they weren't just remaking KOTOR, This does help us out, but not as much as you might think. The thing is, Kirk and Bauer only act in the ways they do because their writers at various points have their certain goals, right? And Bioware didn't seem to realize these characters were more than the binary caricatures that they thought they were. I'm about to talk your ear off about Bauer and Kirk, and this will go on for a minute or two, but stick with me. We're going down this rabbit hole because of Mass Effect, because Mass Effect thinks it's trying to represent Bauer and Kirk. So that means that we should probably know what Kirk and Bauer are like as characters. And we're about to find out that Bioware had a pretty shaky grasp on who Bauer and Kirk actually were. Based on Bioware's take on Kirk, it seems like they only watched the start of the 1982 movie Star Trek II: Wrath of Khan. What a fun movie. In this revenge story, we meet charming, aged Kirk as a heroic character who doesn't accept a no-win scenario. Kirk refuses to accept, even in a simulation, that people might have to die for the greater good. Kirk isn't intended to look like a naive idealist, though, at least not by the end of the movie. The movie ends with Khan forcing Kirk to accept that there are no-win scenarios. Spock dies, saving the Enterprise. Kirk unhappily accepting the loss of his dearest friend is the real climax of Wrath of Khan. Wrath of Khan is great, but this movie arguably retcons Star Trek the original series, which ran from 1966 to 1969. Before the release of Wrath of Khan, the original series usually depicted Kirk as someone who accepted that some of his crew may need to die. Like, there's a lot of red shirts that die on Kirk's 5-year voyage. There's a reason why we have that saying about red shirts. Indeed, there are 56 dead by one count across the 3 seasons, which averages to about 1 crew death every other episode. Yeah, like, none of these red shirts are Spock, so their deaths are maybe not as emotionally impactful to Kirk, but they were all no-win scenarios for him. And that means Wrath of Khan is presenting Kirk in a way that quietly retcons his character in the original series. So if you want to think about this a little bit more clearly, movie Kirk and TV show Kirk, they've got the same actor, they have the same name, but they aren't the same character. Wrath of Khan teaches movie Kirk a lesson that TV show Kirk was already well aware of. Maybe it's not that surprising that Bioware remembers movie Kirk more than they do TV show Kirk. Movie Kirk is the more recent version of Kirk in the pop culture memory. But the thing is, the way Bioware is defining Kirk focuses on the start of that movie and not the end. But even though this movie is starting in a way that strays from Kirk's original characterization, it's doing that so it can end up returning to his original characterization. You know, Kirk's always been forced to sacrifice lives for the greater good. So Bioware's take on Kirk, it's super reductive if we look at the character as a whole. It ignores the way his character is normally always depicted. And it's a very similar situation with 24. The intimidating Jack Bauer does not aim to maximize death. The first season of 24 ends with Bauer unhappily cradling his dead wife in his hands. Because Bauer always has a very limited time to save the day. Only for the greater good does Bauer make choices that directly or indirectly cause death. Okay, maybe most of the time. Sometimes he does want vengeance. But the thing is, if the writers let badass Bauer save his wife's life, like Kirk doing some Kobayashi Maru, it would be totally in character if Bauer did that. Because Bauer is the kind of protagonist who prevents a president's assassination in Season 1 and stops a nuclear bomb and bioweapon in Seasons 2 and 3, respectively. Because, you know, Jack Bauer isn't a sociopath who delights in sacrificing lives just because he could choose not to save lives. In short, Kirk and Bauer are more similar than not when push comes to shove in both 24 and Star Trek. You can easily see them teaming up if the same antagonist were threatening them both. Indeed, if you want to see what that might maybe look like, you can actually just watch Season 3 of Star Trek Enterprise. It's Star Trek and 24 put together. It's very post 9/11. Captain Archer does really questionable stuff to stop some terrorists who want to destroy Earth in the future, so he's got it in the past. It's weird. That said, if Bauer and Kirk initially seem different, it's because their writers usually have different motives. Things are typically going wrong in 24, and in Star Trek, things are usually depicted as happening under more ideal circumstances. Now, when we return to Mass Effect, what this means is that when Bioware designs a game dilemma where it makes sense to act like Kirk reprogramming the Kobayashi Maru in Star Trek, it doesn't also make sense for you to act like Bauer, morally obligated to sacrifice lives in 24, or vice versa for that matter, right? Because if the situation will let me save lives, why would anybody choose not to do that? And if the situation requires people to die for a good outcome, those are the breaks. You know, Bauer would choose to be Kirk if he could, and Kirk will definitely be Bauer if he must. This binary between them, it's therefore artificial. Even if we want to try and fix this binary, we want to shore it up by ignoring TV show Kirk, and we say, oh, we only care about movie Kirk. Like, movie Kirk is called a renegade in Star Trek IV, The Way Home, because he breaks a lot of Federation regulations to save the life of Spock. Cue the angry Klingon.
Behold the quintessential devil in these matters, James T. Kirk, renegade and terrorist.
You heard that, Klingon, right? He's a little out of line, but he's got his facts straight. Movie Kirk will break the law like a renegade to save Spock's life. And now the idea that Paragons are Kirk-like and Renegades are Bauer-like, it's evidently just a bad take on Star Trek in 24. Hey, future Chris here in the editing room. I realized after I was shopping around earlier drafts of this video to people that I made an assumption about something that you know that you might not actually know. And it actually really matters in terms of understanding this whole Paragon and Renegade Kirk versus Bauer scenario fully. Namely that if you didn't know, the Kobayashi Maru, that is a test. And so when Kirk reprograms that test, he's actually cheating on that test. And, you know, cheating is a straightforwardly unethical and morally questionable thing to do. So if you look again at the definition that Chris Latois is giving us about Kirk and Bauer and how they're Paragons and Renegades and how they're supposed to be different in light of their important moral differences in character, what we find is that both Kirk and Bauer are actually willing to do morally questionable things to achieve what they think is the best moral outcome. You know, Kirk will cheat on the Kobayashi Maru, and Bauer will make the hard calls to save lives. These characters are not different according to the way that Bioware is describing them. You have to wildly misinterpret those characters and the franchises they come from to see them as polar opposites, that kind of thing you could design a whole role-playing mechanic around. Unfortunately, it seems like Bioware didn't understand the nuances of Kirk and Bauer, which isn't like ooh, I'm a little nerd and I have a problem with the fact you didn't get your lore straight. No, this is a big oops. And this is a big oops because Bioware was using these characters as templates to generate nuanced alignments. So the end result is that the player doesn't actually get Star Trek's Kirk and 24's Bauer. You get something far more Manichean. You end up with the return of something more KOTOR. We get choices of good and evil. Because, you know, stuff like choosing to let people die just because, that's evil. That's not Jack Bauer. And choosing to save people's lives just because, that's like abstract moral good. That's not Captain Kirk. This is a return of Bioware's light side versus dark side system from KOTOR. So rather than what Latois thinks Bioware intended, in practice, players feel a heck of a lot more like a Jedi or Sith. This is why Mac Walters insightfully noted Renegades let people die and Paragons don't. This is the ugly truth of the matter for better and worse. even if Bioware's original intention was a more complex Kirk versus Bauer dynamic, as Latois has claimed, when that was translated into gameplay where they needed to make the alignments both seem equally viable, it often became the KOTOR dynamic that Walters so accurately describes. Ultimately, it was just a bad idea from the jump if Bioware's original intent was a heroic, charming Kirk versus badass, intimidating Bauer dynamic, because that's just a confusing concept at best. No wonder so many players have often felt the old binary was too restrictive. It's based on an incoherent idea. You're supposed to be getting something like the complexity we see in an RPG like The Witcher 3, where we're choosing between different versions of Geralt. And, we were supposed to be choosing between different versions of one character that was somehow these incompatible visions of Bauer and Kirk. And you just can't consistently implement an inconsistent caricature for complex role-playing. And that's why Renegades are Jack Bauer but as a Sith, and Paragons are Captain Kirk but as a Jedi. All that's missing are the lightsabers, because we basically have force powers if you play as a biotic. Bioware seemed like they were aiming at something between The Witcher 3 and KOTOR, but they mostly delivered KOTOR. At least in, Mass Effect 1 and 2. I've seen so many people over the years criticize Bioware for not having a plan about how to write the trilogy, as if a narrative plan could have prevented the Mass Effect 3 controversy. But I think you can see just how wildly wrong that opinion must be, because the most detailed writing plan in the world couldn't fix the inherent, unrecognized contradictions in Bioware's core gameplay mechanic. Bioware ended up in trouble because they failed to understand what fantasy their mechanics were trying to serve. And, it just doesn't matter who you are. Any developer with such a vague understanding of their core gameplay loop is in hot water. You will every single time disappoint people if you make changes with such murky ideas about your core gameplay mechanic. I get it's funny at some level to see the level of dispute at Bioware, and how do you not know this? How do you not have this straight? How have you spent so much time improving the shooter mechanics across the franchise in response to criticism, but you don't know this? It's kind of funny, but it's also what's killing the franchise, So it's not so funny either. Ultimately, while I suspect that Chris Latois partly put his finger on what the original goal may have been, and Mac Walters teases out how this gives us something that feels a lot more like KOTOR in practice, Bioware's opinions on this subject, as relevant as they are to learn about, they're of dubious value as well. We shouldn't assume Bioware creatives have the last word here about Paragons and Renegades. First, because it seems like their left hand didn't know what their right hand was up to, and second, more generally, more importantly, I think, because we shouldn't assume they have the best insights about their games anyway. My favorite short platonic dialogue, the Ion, is very funny, and it hammers home why we shouldn't take Bioware too seriously. You could read the Ion in 15 minutes. I don't expect you to. I'm going to summarize it here for you right now. In the Ion, Socrates meets a very accomplished creative named Ion. I think he's just come off of winning some prizes. And he's won prizes because he's very good at memorizing and performing from memory the Homeric epics. You probably know someone like Ion today. Ion, he's a portrait of a foolish fan. Ion is the kind of person who has professionally memorized all the lore about a story he loves and likes to impress other people with it. Ion's flaw is thinking his fandom makes him superior. Like so many Socratic interlocutors, Ion confidently thinks he knows stuff that he doesn't know. Ion claims that because he knows the Homeric epics, he knows the subjects they contain. Our man in the ring on the inside, our man Socrates, he takes Ion to task. Turns out, even if Homer said a lot of stuff about war, that doesn't mean Ion's a good general that the city of Athens should call to lead their troops. Ultimately, Ion doesn't really have insight into Homer's works, even if he recites them well, so how could that be? What Socrates is trying to show here, and he does it very quickly and humorously, is that talented creatives don't need to know the work that they create in order to make it. Like Ion, they may have pretensions to the contrary. They may try to convince themselves and a lot of other people that they're an expert on their art, that their opinion really matters. But that's bullshit. And truly, thank God for that. It's a very hard thing to do to create stuff to begin with, and it's a good thing that Ion doesn't need to know how to be a general to perform Homer, and the same totally holds for Bioware. It's a good thing they didn't all need to be moral philosophers with very clear definitions about morality, because that would have made it very hard to design a fun game about moral choices. I mean, yeah, it could probably help to know more things about the kind of thing you're creating for obvious reasons, but thankfully, you don't necessarily need to know a lot to create, because creating stuff usually relies explicitly on inspiration that we can't explain. And this is what Socrates really drives home in the dialogue, that this is like a kind of divine possession, that we're often puppets to our creative muse. We don't really understand the source of what's coming from us. So what the Ion shows for us is that we shouldn't really assume that BioWare has any special insight onto the game they've created. Like, fundamentally, like most creative endeavors, they have to rely on inspiration, and there's going to be a lot of elements that you can't actually explain about it. So maybe they've gotten some things right, I think they have, but they've also gotten a lot of things wrong, as I think we'll see, and we need to look at other evidence to really get an opinion here. Ultimately, there's just going to be a lot of stuff in these games that we actually shouldn't expect they have any insight on to begin with, and that's true of the relationship of any creative to their work. So if we step back now and we're saying, okay, the games themselves have rough definitions and BioWare has dubious help for us, like what do we do next, right? I think the move here is actually pretty clear. If we want to know what it means to play as a Paragon or Renegade in Mass Effect 1 and 2, our best bet is probably just analyzing the player's actual in-game role-playing, right? Because when you do that, it turns out there's a lot more here to see. There's far more political nuance than any of the previously explored definitions would make you think. There's definitely a lot here more than a Manichean tale of an unblemished good Paragon and evil-scarred renegade, and there's even more here to see than a story of a heroic, charming James T. Kirk and badass, intimidating Jack Bauer. So, get ready. Here's my take on Paragons and Renegades. So, let's summarize a Paragon and Renegade playthrough of Mass Effect 1 and 2. This is the most relevant way to define the player's in-game experience. Obviously, the player doesn't have to only make Paragon or Renegade choices in one playthrough, but by assuming that they play that way, we can more easily start to recognize the nuances of these alignments. Let's start with Paragons. A Paragon plays like a charming and diplomatic altruist, an idealist unwilling to risk or sacrifice lives to meet a goal, and an authoritarian bureaucrat fighting injustice through legal and institutional norms. And it generally looks like they fight the Reapers with multicultural principles. A Paragon believes that the galaxy is at its best when different races work together. For example, a Paragon in Mass Effect 1 refuses to defend copyrights with corporate espionage on Noveria. They persuade an evangelist Hanar to comply with the laws limiting religious liberty on the Citadel. They find a way to save all the colonists of Zhu's Hope brainwashed by the Thurian. They refuse to support the xenophobic pro-human group Terra Firma. And at the game's end, they choose to sacrifice human lives to save the multiracial alien council from the Reapers. Similarly, in Mass Effect 2, a Paragon defends a Quarian from the racist persecution of a Volus traitor and human CSEC officer. They also help an Asari detective arrest a Volus drug smuggler, and in the end they destroy the Collector base because it relies on technology that sacrifices hundreds of thousands of people, and because they don't trust Cerberus, a human supremacist group. In contrast, a renegade plays like an intimidating and ruthless egotist, a pragmatist willing to risk lives to achieve goals, and a libertarian iconoclast fighting injustice outside of legal and institutional norms. They prefer to fight Reapers with human supremacy. A renegade seems to think that only humans are able to do whatever it takes to unite the galaxy against the Reapers. Hence, a renegade in Mass Effect 1 helps enforce copyrights with corporate espionage on Noveria. They prevent the Alliance from violating Samesh Bhattia's right to cremate his deceased wife. They also kill all the colonists of Zoo's Hope. They support terra firma. They sacrifice the Alien Council to ensure the human fleet can kill Sovereign, and then they reveal they made that choice to empower humanity and back Udina's proposed coup for an all-human council to prepare for the Reapers. Similarly, in Mass Effect 2, a renegade helps Asari, unjustly classified as Geth infiltrators, clear Citadel customs with Harkin's forged IDs. A renegade also sacrifices innocent enslaved workers on Zoria to ensure the loyalty of their squadmate Zaid. And they also give the collector base intact to Cerberus, enabling the elusive man's dream of humanity dominating the Reapers and all the other races. Ultimately, Paragons and Renegades are defined by these recognizable patterns. These alignments reflect a set of moral opinions as well as a personality we can diagram like so. First, we have the personality ingredient for Paragons and Renegades. The Paragon is a charming and diplomatic altruist, while the Renegade is an intimidating and ruthless egotist. Then we have a moral ingredient, different attitudes about risking lives for desirable outcomes. The Paragon painstakingly tries to avoid risking lives to achieve the best outcomes, while the devil-may-care Renegade embraces risking lives to achieve the best outcomes. Our next moral ingredient touches on the alignment's ideals for achieving justice. A Paragon is an authoritarian who fights injustice through legal and institutional norms. They do it by the book or not at all. The Renegade is more libertarian. They fight injustice outside of legal and institutional norms. Bureaucracy is contemptible red tape. You don't let arbitrary rules get in the way of justice. Our final moral ingredient is the alignment's differing political opinions about racial conflict. Paragons think multiculturalism will save a divided galaxy from itself and the Reapers, while Renegades believe human supremacy will save a divided galaxy from itself and the Reapers. This diagram is, in essence, the design recipe for the story of Mass Effect 1 and 2, the unspoken set of assumptions which define the alignment mechanic. I've arrived at this conclusion by reviewing on the Mass Effect wiki every single action that grants you Paragon or Renegade points in Mass Effect 1 and 2. Yeah, it took a while. And just so you know, the game doesn't always make it visually obvious when you're getting Paragon and Renegade points, and that's why it's actually more reliable to read the wiki if you want to see how all the points and choices tie together. Ultimately, I'd say, as a rule, wherever there are choices that grant the player with Paragon and Renegade points, you'll find they're pretty much going to reliably follow the diagram I just gave you. At least one, if not more, ingredients is usually present in every single alignment choice. So, you know, sometimes it might be about the human supremacy versus multiculturalism, but it might also be about sacrificing lives, say with the ending of Mass Effect 1, or it could just be about, you know, are you treating people nicely? This could just be a personality choice, or it could be a personality choice and a way of approaching, say, the legal and institutional norms. It depends. Like, sometimes we get one ingredient, sometimes we get two, sometimes we even get three. We almost never get all four at once. Usually it's just one or two, but we're always getting at least one of these ingredients. And once you start to appreciate this, you can see why it's so hard to understand alignment mechanics. It's a difficult task to define a recipe which doesn't always need all its ingredients. I kind of think of this like a recipe for a garbage omelet. You know, a garbage omelet is a type of omelet that has everything sort of mixed into it. And if you had the recipe for a garbage omelet, you could alter it into a cheese or a Denver omelet or some other kind of omelet on the fly. Nonetheless, we still recognize that the garbage omelet is a type of omelet. If you study this recipe closely, you can even see how Bioware's Kirk v. Bauer definition is a reductive version of this garbage omelet recipe. It's capturing two of the ingredients, but it's leaving out two other equally important ones. And the same is arguably true of the whole good versus evil way of understanding Paragons and Renegades. This is a reductive version of the recipe that we've just looked at. Our recipe captures all the nuances much more thoroughly. Now, I know what some of you were thinking. There are definitely moments where there are exceptions to this recipe. Occasionally, alignment choices don't follow the pattern I just laid out. And I've come to believe that the exceptions to this pattern are much more frequent in Mass Effect 2 than Mass Effect 1, and you can see this most frequently with the loyalty missions. Consider, for example, the final choice in Legion, Morden, and Miranda's missions. What's Paragon about rewriting Heretic Geth, keeping Malin's unethical research, and pressuring Miranda into connecting with her sister Oriana? Why is it Renegade to destroy heretics, delete Malin's data, and let Miranda make her own decisions about Oriana? Respecting someone's decisions is not like deleting unethically sourced data, and rewriting the Reaper simping Geth out of their religious convictions is nothing like reconnecting two sisters. There's very little ideological similarity between these Paragon and Renegade choices. Alignment choices like these are unique, they follow no pattern. They are moral choices, but not the kind players are trained to expect. These are random, not necessarily good or bad ingredients that have been put in our omelet. These unique moral dilemmas, which arguably don't fit within the established alignment mechanics, are more akin to the kinds of bespoke moral dilemmas a player will expect in The Witcher 3. Now, you might wonder, why did this happen? And I suspect it happened because we know Bioware had different writers assigned to different characters, and Bioware seemed to lack an internal consensus on what defines Paragons and Renegades. So even if you aren't trying to create Witcher 3 moral dilemmas that don't follow alignment rules, you've got a recipe right here for loyalty missions, which are sometimes going to operate by their own rules on what defines a Paragon and Renegade choice, even if this bucks design trends that you can see in the rest of the game. Too many cooks in the kitchen cooking with different recipes will use some different ingredients, right? Nonetheless, I think oddball loyalty missions like these and other choices like them are rather infrequent, so infrequent that they prove the existence of our rule. For every uncategorizable alignment choice like these, I think there's at least 10 that fit our prescribed pattern. All in all, there is a signal in the noise. There are some truly random ingredients mixed in, some choices that don't make sense when you compare them to any other, but when you look at the overall picture and the way that the games grant points as a whole, there's definitely a reliable recipe designing alignments. Now that we know the recipe for alignments, we can modify pieces of the recipe as we need to. We can change, add, or remove ingredients. We can even cook them differently, so to speak. We could change the way the existing ingredients were implemented, how they were put together in terms of the player's experience. So given all that, what exactly should we change? What needs fixing or enhancing, or what should we actually just leave alone? Well, it's safe to say that ever since the release of Mass Effect 1 and 2, that a lot of people have criticized a lot of things about the alignment mechanics. And overall, the most common form of criticism you see is fundamentally that this mechanic is too restrictive. This piece of conventional wisdom, it's kind of useless. The mechanics of a game exist to limit the dynamics to create specific aesthetics for players. Put in less technical jargon, all game designs exist precisely to create specific fantasies for players. So if we're trying to diagnose how best to redesign a mechanic, it's not very useful to seriously listen to people whining about a gameplay mechanic being restrictive. You might as well listen to someone complaining about a sweater keeping them feeling too warm. Sweaters are supposed to keep you warm, and game mechanics are supposed to be restrictive to create a specific fantasy. That's not a problem. So what this means is we need to move beyond the conventional critiques of Mass Effect 1 and 2's alignment system. These are critiques that inspired Bioware to change too much and too little about alignments, and we need to distinguish what's good from bad. We need to change only just the right stuff. And doing this, again, it's going to be like walking a tightrope that we can only hope to succeed in walking if we specify our target fantasy. And as I said at the start of this video, I think the unique fantasy Mass Effect can offer is one where we choose the moral of the story and we feel we get wiser by reasoning over nuanced dilemmas. Put another way, this unique fantasy is akin to mixing certain parts of the Witcher 3 and KOTOR together. But not all the parts, right? Because what we don't want is a fantasy that either isn't about alignments, like The Witcher 3, or a fantasy that's just about good versus evil, which would be like KOTOR. These are elements of The Witcher 3 and KOTOR which are ultimately totally incompatible. You really can't have them both at the same time without feeling like they're just at odds with each other. They're not complementary. Ultimately, we want to enhance the unique fantasy that Mass Effect 1 and 2 promised and struggled to deliver. Our goal is not to please a vocal minority or try to appeal to everyone. To hit our target fantasy, I'm going to diagnose problems and propose solutions separately. And when I diagnose problems, I'm going to show how they harm our target fantasy and why. And then later, when I come back and propose solutions, I'm going to do the same thing again. We're going to talk about how these solutions enhance our target fantasy and why. Overall, I'm going to consider alternatives where I think it makes sense and weigh their relative merits. And because we obviously can't playtest the design changes that we're going to be considering here, I'm going to be looking for design precedent in the games if possible. You know, a moment where the games either do something exactly what we're suggesting or something rather similar to it. Because if we have a proposed idea for how to fix something and there's design precedent for it, that pretty much tells us that our fix is going to feel kind of faithful to the prior games. And we want that as much as practically possible. And again, since we can't playtest, there's really no other way we can try and guess whether players will feel our change is true in that sense, true to the older games, I mean. Because at the end of the day, I can't change too much about Mass Effect 3, or else it won't pay off the fantasy the prior games set up. Mass Effect 1 and 2 had key Paragon and Renegade choices that Mass Effect 3 arguably needs to deliver on. Stuff like the Arachni Queen, or Zhu's Hope, or the fate of the Council, the Collector base, etc. You know, if I wasn't trying to redesign Mass Effect 3, I could be more aggressive in proposing changes to the alignment system. You know, I would be looking beyond just the execution, and I would even be considering changing the ideological content, maybe even the names of alignments. But you know, I don't want to change that much because I don't want to make Mass Effect 3 disappoint by being about something else than we expect based on the prior games. And also, I think it's more useful if we just talk about Mass Effect 3 right now, rather than the possibilities for the franchise beyond it. You know, demonstrating that we can fix Mass Effect 3, and by that I mean make it about alignment mechanics, give it improved alignment mechanics. This is our proof of concept for the fact that the wider franchise would benefit from returning to this kind of gameplay. Again, there's no play testing here. All we can do is theory craft. So we can't really know if our target fantasy or our diagnosis or our fixes are hitting the most relevant mark. But that's often how it is in life, right? Ultimately, I think there are 7 separate but related fundamental flaws worth detailing for us. The first problem is that players are sometimes given way too much mechanical ability to influence the alignments of crewmate NPCs into becoming more Paragon or Renegade. When reacting to dilemmas, our crewmates often act much less like Socrates and far more like sock puppets. This makes us less invested in both our crewmates and the moral dilemmas throughout the game, and both of these things really hurt our target fantasy. Indeed, if you weren't aware, Mass Effect 1 assigns a Paragon and Renegade score to your various crewmates. Through your choices, you can influence them to become more Paragon or Renegade over time. The best execution of this gameplay occurs with Garrus, You either encourage him to work within the legal system like a Paragon, or you encourage him to lean into extrajudicial justice like a renegade. Garrus's conversations revolve around this debate, where his character will go, and it's the same thing in his personal mission with Dr. Salion. And with much more imperfect execution, other crewmates like Tali, Rex, Kaidan, Ashley, and Liara work much the same in Mass Effect 1. Come Mass Effect 2, it does away with this design tactic of calculating secret Paragon and Renegade scores, but it keeps the design strategy of influencing crewmates into Paragons or Renegades. That's why loyalty missions usually end with alignment choices, though, as I noted earlier, the loyalty missions tend to struggle with writing their alignment choices consistently. These are all actually fantastic design ideas that serve our target fantasy, the idea that we're steering our crewmates and becoming more like a Paragon and Renegade. It fits with what we're trying to do. The problem here, though, it's the execution of this idea often pulls us out of our target fantasy. All too frequently, the player gets full control over how Paragon or Renegade their crewmates become, and they just can't push back against us. This shatters the illusion these characters have agency to disagree with us, and that undermines our ability to emotionally invest in them. At the same time, that makes it so that moral dilemmas are just less engaging, because our crewmates, while they're not Socrates, they're not interesting to debate with about the ethical dilemmas. It's arguably for these reasons that so many fans don't care about the boring Kaidan and Jacob. It's safe to say Kaidan is the Mass Effect 1 crewmate most consistently criticized as boring by fans, and Jacob has this dubious distinction in Mass Effect 2. These two beta bros have the same problems. Yes, their facial animations can sometimes feel uncanny valley compared to the non-human squadmates. That certainly doesn't help them, and they also have another strike against them, which is that Bioware does have a spotty track record when it comes to writing male starter companions in their RPGs. The much bigger issue, though, is that both Jacob and Kaidan fail in too many moments to ethically challenge and oppose us when they should. The player's alignment is allowed to override these characters' alignments. We can't just influence these characters in a gradual and plausible way, like how it goes with Garrus in Mass Effect 1. No, Jacob and Kaidan are much more like putty in our hands. For example, a renegade femshep romancing Paragon Kaidan can 180 his character into an aggrieved human supremacist. Even worse, he's barely opinionated about the biotic antagonists in Mass Effect 1. There's 2 side missions with biotic terrorists in Mass Effect 1. This is where we get the "I will destroy you" line that Jack picks up much later. But in one of these missions, biotic terrorists have taken a hostage to force the Alliance to give them reparations for their faulty L2 implants. The same implant Kaidan gets debilitating migraines from. So this mission about these biotics with their L2 implants, it must have been designed because of Kaidan, or Kaidan must have been designed because of this mission. Kaidan should have strong opinions about how we handle this mission. He's an L2, he's in their boat, but he's obviously living a different life than they are. But Kaidan has very little to say if you bring him on this mission, and no matter what, he is going to follow our lead. And if Kaidan can't conflict with us on how we handle this mission, Kaidan just ceases to matter. Why should we care what Kaidan thinks about other dilemmas if he doesn't have strong opinions about this? Like, this is the story committing to a focus on Kaidan's backstory, and Kaidan can't commit to having an opinion. Well, if Kaidan feels boring to fans, it's because the alignment mechanics are kneecapping his Socratic potential. And Jacob, he's really got the same problem, but it's far more egregious. I realize this is going to sound odd, but Jacob should be the most memorable squadmate in Mass Effect 2. I'm not joking. Jacob was done a real disservice. Because, think about Jacob. Think about his backstory. Think about who he is, how he's presented to us. Jacob is the truest foil to Shepard in Mass Effect 2. First off, he's a human, and he also has a prototypical Paragon-turned Renegade Black Ops backstory. Jacob left the Alliance for Cerberus, so Jacob should be ready to reason with us, like Socrates, about the pros or cons of the Paragon Alliance and Renegade Cerberus. Jacob's already navigated the transition that Shepard is making in this game. Jacob is an ideal interlocutor for Shepard. Unfortunately, Jacob rarely challenges or opposes Shepard on the basis of his alignment, even though he was very clearly designed to uniquely be great at that. And the most obvious betrayal of Jacob's character where this happens is that Shepard can, without any dialogue, force Jacob to agree if they decide to destroy the collector base. I mean, you're turning your back on the elusive man there, and Jacob's just like, I guess I agree. It's just ridiculous that Jacob is going to accept whatever decision we make on the collector base. This is really his moment to shine, the moment for the story to make him stand out against us and us stand out against him. Or maybe to find that we've both arrived in the same place. I mean, either of those would be awesome. Jacob should really be the squadmate with the most unique take on the final choice in Mass Effect 2. So if he has a reputation for being boring, that's arguably mostly because his alignment, it's total putty in our hands. So, bulldozing alignments here. It's an obvious issue with Jacob and Kaidan, but other squadmates sometimes suffer from the same problem too. Like, check out Miranda. Miranda, like Jacob, shouldn't accept Shepard betraying Cerberus in Mass Effect 2. She shouldn't just resign from Cerberus if we make a Paragon choice. By the same token, why doesn't Jack oppose us if we give the collector base to Cerberus? Jack is impulsive, violent, she hates Cerberus, she has a lot of reason to. There's no world in which she would accept Shepard empowering Cerberus with the collector base. She would totally go out with her gun pointed against us. Don't even get me started on the uber Paragon Samara. She swears to make her morals our morals. And she effectively promises to kill us if we force her into making too many renegade choices to stop the collectors. And that conflict would really feel earned, but it never happens. The most hardcore renegade faces no consequences from Samara, which means I guess that oath, and maybe her entire oath, is kind of a joke. In short, there's actually a lot of moments where squadmates act out of character because the alignment mechanics force them into effective agreement with our alignment. Jacob and Kaidan are just these squadmates who suffer from this problem in a highly visible way while lacking other redeeming qualities that would make us forgive them for acting so spinelessly. In the end, this first problem makes our squadmates boring and it undermines alignment dilemmas, because if they're boring, it's hard to be invested in the dilemmas they say matter. This experience of our squadmates just kind of rolling over, it's not our target fantasy for Mass Effect. Both KOTOR and The Witcher 3 knew better than to let us undermine NPCs or dilemmas like that. Like take KOTOR. If you got this delightful Twi'lek named Mission Vow, she's clearly on the light side, and if at the end of the game you mask off as a dark side Sith, missions, she's gonna oppose you, full stop, no two ways about it, and you're gonna be forced to kill her. If you're really sick, you'll make her best friend kill her instead. Whew. Now, very similarly, in The Witcher 3, the ever-slippery spy master Dijkstra won't let us mess up his schemes. If we try to oppose Dijkstra's plots in Redania, he will kill us. Or he will try to kill us. Obviously, we win, right? Frankly, I don't think it's an accident that the most beloved Mass Effect squadmates are the ones who act like Mission and Dijkstra, the ones who get meaningful independence from our choices. Just look at Rex and Mordin. These two squadmates get to realize their Socratic potential all throughout the series. If Rex is a Thresher Maw killing fan favorite, it's at least partly because he has the moral conviction to shoot you when he thinks you're a monster. This happens not just in Mass Effect 1, but Mass Effect 3 as well. And it's not because Rex is looking to argue with you, he's not a hothead, he's not trying to disagree for the sake of disagreeing. Rex, when he opposes you, does so because he has moral ideals you can't just easily override. You can only influence him so much. And Mordin's beloved status comes from a very similar place. This Gilbert and Sullivan singing Solarian is willing to stand up to you in both Mass Effect 2 and 3. I love his loyalty mission in Mass Effect 2. It's a real ongoing debate between you and Morden, and if you oppose his ideas on the Genophage in 3, oh boy, is it a real gut punch. Both these characters, they act like Socrates in Plato's Apology. They have ethical ideals that they defend, even if it means death. And we're forced to respect that. Their moral compass helps act as a foil to shape our own. This kind of character, it's always the most memorable in an RPG that's trying to do our target fantasy, especially because so few other squadmates get to have this mechanical independence from Shepard. Characters like Rex and Morden make the key dilemmas in the game really matter, because we care what they think. So it's a shame Kaidan and Jacob aren't given the agency over their moral ideals that Rex and Morden get. So looking at all that, it seems that most Mass Effect players, based on the reception of Rex and Morden, want the kind of fantasy where their choices definitely matter the most. This is still your game. But you also want a fantasy where sometimes your squadmates will ethically oppose you. Ultimately, it seems like losing a squadmate is a more enjoyable role-playing experience than them acting out of character just to please you and your alignment. It's not a lot of fun to morally reason with a bunch of Kaidans and Jacobs who show their bellies and roll over. We love it when a Rex or Morden challenges us, especially and brutally if we maybe need to kill them for doing so. So when push comes to shove, what better way is there, actually, if you think about it, to dramatize the stakes of a moral dilemma? If squadmates we care about don't care about a dilemma, we just don't have that much reason to care about the dilemma ourselves. Ultimately, the most memorable dilemmas force us to verbally or physically fight with our beloved squadmates. Therefore, it's just bad that we can sometimes override our squadmates' alignments with our own. This undermines the best tools the story has to make us deeply care. It undermines our squadmates, and it undermines the moral dilemmas. Let's move on to a more general flaw. The second flaw with the alignment mechanic is the way it incentivizes players. Namely, players are less incentivized to prioritize quests and resolve ethical dilemmas on a case-by-case basis. No, they're far more encouraged to exclusively commit to one alignment and grind all side missions first whenever possible. This undermines our target fantasy by encouraging players to always make choices in the most rigid, uncreative, and mindless way. A highly memorable example of this dynamic in Mass Effect 1, it's probably your fight with Saren at the end. In that fight, you can actually talk Saren, the main antagonist, into killing himself. But only if you've been sufficiently dogmatic about your alignments and prioritized enough side quests before the finale. Very similarly, the most infamous example of this same dynamic in Mass Effect 2, the thing that people really like to complain about, it's probably the loyalty conflicts in that game. These conflicts occur after you get the loyalty of Jack and Miranda, or Tali and Legion. Now, you don't want to lose anybody's loyalty here. It's very bad if you do that, because it's going to increase their likelihood of dying in the suicide mission, as well as the likelihood that other crewmates or Shepard also die in the suicide mission. So the stakes are high. You don't really want to lose anybody's alignment. And if you've been making ethical choices on a case-by-case basis, or, just prioritizing the main missions, rather than the fluff content, well, you might not be able to actually keep everybody's loyalty. But if you've committed to the not-so-fun method of grinding out everything in one alignment and doing every side quest when it appears, you're probably going to be totally fine. Ultimately, this means you're incentivized to play Mass Effect 1 and 2 in a way that's very grindy, partisan, not creative, rigid. The game is demanding you play one way. Should you even call this an RPG? I mean, you can see this restrictive dynamic in every conversation throughout Mass Effect 1 and 2. In any conversation, the player always sees what choices a Paragon or Renegade could make, even if they're not allowed to make the choice. This will happen if you haven't acquired enough of the relevant alignment points. So as a result, you're getting a constant visual reminder in every conversation to play the game in a way that totally undermines our target fantasy. Almost every time you have a moral choice, the game is pushing you to turn your brain off. You're actively discouraged from re-examining whether a different alignment might be appropriate for each dilemma. This dynamic, it undermines the best things about the Paragon Renegade mechanic. At its best, the alignment mechanic is incentivizing you to prioritize quests and morally reason for its own sake, to do things in the order that make the most sense to you, and to do what makes the most sense to you, not for any other reason. But that's not really how it normally works, right? The norm is that the alignment mechanic does the opposite. It incentivizes prioritizing the grindiest parts of the game, and it degrades the act of moral reasoning into mindless button mashing. The third flaw with the alignment mechanic hides in plain sight. In theory, this mechanic aims to simulate moral reasoning by representing a set of moral viewpoints. In practice, this mechanic arbitrarily restricts how you can mix the moral viewpoints. For example, you may not mix a Paragon's authoritarian reliance on legal and institutional norms with a Renegade's interest in human supremacy. Can't be for the law and human supremacy, to put it very simply. And very similarly, you may not mix a Paragon's multicultural zeal with a Renegade's libertarian desire to fight injustice outside the legal and institutional norms. You can't be a fan of multiculturalism and working outside the system if you think it's corrupt. And this is so wild. Why is it like this? This denies players nuanced ethical choices that the mechanics are actually constantly implying are possible, that you could do, but you're just not allowed. Like, imagine if you could criticize the authoritarian council like a renegade, but by using the Paragon's logic that they exploit the Volus, Elcor, and the other lesser races. Or imagine for that matter that you could criticize Cerberus's lack of accountability to galactic law like a Paragon, but by using the renegade logic that their embrace of silly experimentation that's illegal, it just gets them killed, so they're actually very ineffective as human supremacists. If they went by the book, they'd be better at ruling the galaxy with an iron fist for humanity. I know that may sound wild, but it's not like these mixtures of moral attitudes are illogical or uninteresting. They're certainly relevant to Mass Effect, you're just not allowed to have them. As a result, it's very difficult to hit our target fantasy with such an ideologically dogmatic design. The fourth flaw is very similar to the last one. It's not just that the games arbitrarily limit the kind of moral viewpoints you can combine, they also do the same with personalities and moral opinions. This is why players can't mix a Paragon's personality with a Renegade's morality, or vice versa. In effect, a Paragon is never allowed to act like an intimidating hardass, and a Renegade is never allowed to talk like a charming diplomat. There are no exceptions. This is equally as frustrating as it is implausible. Like, all of us are wise enough to know that personalities and moral attitudes come in more mixtures in real life. If I was going to put that a little bit more colloquially, I would say that you can be an asshole committed to virtuous causes or a incredibly polite person working towards vile ends. People with the same personality can even disagree with each other about various moral issues like, say, in Mass Effect, law, race, sacrificing lives, etc. And, by that same token, people who have the same political and ethical opinions can also have very different personalities. And, we actually see this in the NPCs in Mass Effect 1 and 2. They have more interesting mixtures of personality and ethics than Shepard does. The only way to roleplay a libertarian in these games, or a human supremacist, it's as a bully. And the only way to roleplay an authoritarian or multiculturalist is as a diplomat. This design choice it's arbitrary. It undermines our target fantasy with a psychologically and ideologically dogmatic design. The fifth flaw differs from the other flaws. It's not actually a feature, it's more of a bug. The issue is that the alignment mechanic has an ingredient about sacrifice which is inconsistently implemented. A consequence of this is that renegade choices often seem sociopathic or foolish, and this undermines our target fantasy by making Mass Effect play way too much like KOTOR. It feels like one of these alignments is very short-sighted and, almost comically evil, doesn't understand that it's incompetent. As we've seen, Mass Effect 1 and 2 implied that renegades sacrifice lives to ensure the best outcomes, while Paragons will risk those outcomes as they refuse to sacrifice lives. That's the theory, anyway. But we've seen Mac Walters insightfully note that in practice we're getting something very different than that, right? We're getting something a lot more reductive, a scenario where Paragons save people's lives, great, and renegades just let people die. Whatever the original goal was, it's actually rarely the case that Paragons are risking the best outcome because they refuse to potentially sacrifice lives. Things usually always work out for Paragons. They get to not risk lives, and then they get the good consequence. They get their cake and they get to eat it too. They get to save lives without any trade-offs, and that's an inconsistent design, right? It hurts our target fantasy if one alignment choice is predictably so much better than the other. If I can always get a much better outcome as a Paragon, this removes the reasons to even consider playing like a Renegade. It makes it seem like all of their moral ideas must be as stupid as the fact that they let people die, because if they're stupid about this, they're probably stupid about the other things too, right? And ultimately, I think the issue here is a conceptual one. The entire idea that it might be worth it or not to sacrifice lives for the best outcomes only makes sense in terms of those outcomes. But if the best outcomes are not consistently defined, what does this actually mean? Look at what the Renegade does. Are they trading lives because they want to make some money, some credits? Are they looking to blow off some steam? Are they just a weird fan of Morinth? Do they want to fight easier combat sequences? Are they trying to make a vengeful squadmate happy? They just try to confirm the kill on Sovereign? Or are they looking to do a human supremacist coup? You don't always know why a Renegade is sacrificing lives, and most of the time you're not allowed to say why. Mass Effect 1 and 2 are inconsistent about your motivations. The only consistent reason that you can infer why a Paragon or Renegade is saving or sacrificing lives is ultimately for its own sake, right? It's as if Renegades were Sith Lords on vacation rather than Jack Bauer making a sacrifice he would prefer not to, but feel duty requires of him. And Paragons end up looking like messianic figures, not Captain Kirk making choices that may kill Spock. There's no Khan Noonien Singh here to punish the Paragon, but boy, does it always feel like Renegade gameplay is punished. So we have an experience here that resembles KOTOR almost to the exclusion of The Witcher 3. These inconsistencies undermine our target fantasy. One alignment feels morally and practically superior at all times, which makes it way too easy for the player to ethically reason. You can't feel like you're getting wiser if it's always obvious to you what is good and evil. The sixth flaw enhances the problems with the fifth flaw. The issue is that Renegade choices make your avatar gain facial scars, while Paragon choices make them unblemished. Now, yeah, you can use some in-game resources to eliminate scars if you really want to, but this mechanic is going to make players infer that Renegades are moral and that Paragons are virtuous, and that simple binary hurts our target fantasy. The basic idea here, as I said before, and it's a very old one in many storytelling traditions, is that physical deformity is a sign of a moral flaw. That's why you have a lot of evil characters in stories that are disfigured. This is visual shorthand for you're bad. But the thing is, this idea doesn't make any sense with our target fantasy, because again, we're all wise enough to know that beauty isn't a reliable sign of virtue. We all know that beautiful people can do very ugly things. So this facial scar mechanic, it's a wildly reductive take on morality, one that any of us can debunk with a second's reflection. Even worse, the facial scars indicate that alignment choices fit within a good and evil binary, which undermines the likelihood that players are going to be morally reasoning. If the game is going to visually tell me what's good and evil, why should I bother to think for myself? If we want to hit our target fantasy, then the scar mechanics were a very bad addition to Mass Effect 2. Because these scars on the face of Renegade Shepard and this unblemished Paragon Shepard, this is a moral shortcut. This is a visual cheat sheet. It's telling you what's evil and what's good. If you disagree with me, if you liked the addition of the scar mechanics, I guess that's because you feel that Mass Effect should not offer a different fantasy than the one it was. It should just be KOTOR and not more like The Witcher 3. And if that's the case, I imagine you probably don't appreciate a lot of my prior fixes insofar as I've been trying to balance parts of KOTOR and The Witcher 3 together. Now, it's possible that I'm just wrong, right? But I suspect the people who hold that opinion are in the minority. If many fans of the series commonly criticize Mass Effect for feeling restrictive, it's because here and elsewhere it's cribbing way too much from KOTOR's design. If we want Mass Effect to reliably deliver on our target fantasy, the facial scarring mechanic is bad. I saved the 7th flaw for last because even though it's the most well-known and recognized flaw, it's more accurate to say it's an effect caused by the other flaws. As I suspect you already know, these games over-incentivize you to play as a Paragon at all times and not as a Renegade. Mass Effect 2 and 3 cinematic designer John Ebinger confirmed this dynamic back in 2020. Apparently, to Bioware's surprise, I don't know how this came as a surprise, but apparently, to Bioware's surprise, 92% of players played Paragon and not Renegade. These numbers are another way to think about how much Mass Effect struggled to hit our target fantasy. That's just how far away we are from the game seeming like we've got options that are equally plausible that we should reason about and think are interesting ways to tell the moral of the story. And I think now that we've diagnosed the other flaws, we're really ready to see what's causing the 7th flaw, because I do think it's just an effect of the other flaws and that you can't tackle it head on to solve it. You probably have to understand the other flaws first. Now, if we look back, the 2nd flaw, it pushed players to stick to either the Paragon or Renegade path. But the 3rd flaw forces you to double down on that even more by preventing you from making nuanced alignment choices. So 2nd and 3rd, we choose either or. But then when you add the 4th, 5th, and 6th flaw, it's just inevitable that most people are going to go Paragon and not Renegade. If you don't let people mix moral ideals with personalities, the 4th flaw makes it seem like Renegades are easily offended bullies, and Paragons are unflappable, charismatic, even noble. And then if you add the 5th flaw on top of that, Renegades, they just don't seem like bullies who lose their temper. They become sociopathic and foolish Sith. And Paragons start to look straight up like heroic and messianic Jedi. Because the inconsistent implementation of this alignment mechanic, it makes it look like the Renegades are far too willing to sacrifice lives that the Paragon could have found a way to save without incurring significant negative consequences. So the Renegade, they don't just seem evil for its own sake, they seem dumb when we compare them to the Paragons. And, players hate to feel dumb. So they're not going to go Renegade. Making this even worse, you add in the 6th flaw, you have an old storytelling trope about beauty and ugliness encouraging you to turn your brain right off during role-playing, to see Paragons as good and Renegades as evil. This is why Patrick Weeks noted in an interview that players usually think that Paragons are good and Renegades are bad, even though this wasn't exactly Bioware's intention. He has this notable moment where he says, rightly or wrongly, I think he's pretty tacitly admitting that, we didn't intend to do this, but we kind of did it by accident in a lot of places.
We never really meant for Paragon or Renegade to be good guy versus bad guy, but rightly or wrongly, whatever we intended, people really felt like Paragon was good guy and Renegade was bad guy.
Ultimately, it just seems like Renegades idealize temper tantrums and violence, and Paragons are virtue personified. Moral alignments in Mass Effect feel way too familiar to the ethical alignments in KOTOR. So again, to recap, like how this is all coming together to create our issue of everybody wanting to play Paragon, not Renegade. We got flaws number 2 and 3 making it so that you want to pick one alignment or the other. And then you got 4, 5, and 6 making it so that you're going to go Paragon, not Renegade. It just seems more just and wise to choose Paragon all the time and never Renegade. And obviously, this makes it almost impossible for Mass Effect 1 and 2 to reliably deliver on our target fantasy. Now, I guess I could imagine that some people might like the way this works, right, in Mass Effect 1 and 2. That might like how you disproportionately punish one alignment and reward the other. And so I guess they wouldn't even see that there's a problem here, right? Well, I think if somebody feels this way, it's probably because they think that the Renegade alignment is actually vicious, and that Paragons are just virtuous, and they want the games to teach this viewpoint to players. I imagine some people believe this, but again, I think they're in the minority. The overwhelming majority of people who praise Mass Effect say, we love this because it has memorable decisions that provoke us to think, not because this is a game that's great at teaching one moral ideal that acts like really good propaganda. People like when Mass Effect tries to deliver on the target fantasy that we've been talking about. Indeed, I'd say that this is kind of what makes Mass Effect unique as a AAA franchise period, and then also unique as an RPG, because it's focusing on ethical deliberation in this very special way. At its best, it's interested in making you think, and it's not interested in you just arriving at one ethical position. And this philosophical dynamic, it's what makes Mass Effect itself. And it's a problem the game tends to train you out of this dynamic in almost every turn. Ultimately, it's a key flaw that these games fail to live up to the full potential of what makes them stand out as RPGs in the first place. It's bad if everyone plays Paragon, not Renegade. If Mass Effect is to embrace what makes this franchise so unique, it can't just be KOTOR. It can definitely share design ideas with KOTOR, but it also needs to share design ideas from The Witcher 3. So when you're sitting there playing Mass Effect 1 and 2 and you experience all these flaws at once, it feels overwhelming. That's why the Paragon Renegade mechanic tends to be so frequently criticized, why people love to dogpile on it. These mechanics, when you look at them, they imply that there's a level of ethical nuance out here, that you can mix and match different viewpoints and personalities together, but you don't actually get that nuance in your roleplay. And that generates the feeling the mechanic is very restrictive, It feels like the limits here are arbitrary, not intentional. Why do I have to play this one way rather than the other? Why are you giving me a false idea of moral equivalence? Our target fantasy, it feels like a pipe dream when we see all these design forces that are working against it. And if few AAA RPGs ever since Mass Effect have used binary alignment-based mechanics, that's partly because of how rightfully criticized this old-school alignment mechanic was. There's a reason why The Witcher 3 was marketed as offering a morally indifferent world to explore. That's a game that came out a few years after Mass Effect, and that marketing about a morally indifferent world, it's actually misleading. The Witcher 3 is filled with all sorts of ethical dilemmas. It's not indifferent. So what is it saying? The marketing here is not trying to actually represent the moral universe of The Witcher. It's a calculated move to distance The Witcher 3 as much as possible from the branding of Mass Effect. But if you look here, these franchises, they share certain design ideas, very important ones. For better or worse, it seems like the idea of a binary RPG like Mass Effect seems outdated because of stuff like The Witcher 3. The old alignment mechanic made for a restrictive, unrealistic, and inconsistent role-playing dynamic. Mass Effect 1 and 2 may owe their essence to that alignment mechanic, but the execution sucked. I feel fully confident saying that. The flaws here, they're so substantial that it's reasonable to doubt that you could actually fix things here without losing the identity of the alignment mechanic. If too much is rotten here, we do just have to toss things out. And that means we need to move in the design direction of Mass Effect 3 or Mass Effect Andromeda. You know, the first there, it downgraded alignment mechanics, and the second just cut them out entirely. At least, this is what it looks like right now. Things aren't actually this dire. This mechanic appears to be in far worse shape than it actually is. I've intentionally done everything I can to make the situation seem hopeless and grim, because I want us to empathize with Bioware. They had a really tough nut to crack. And if we aren't really pleased with the results, I mean, just look at the problems they were confronting. They had to fix a mechanic that they were struggling to understand, which players vaguely criticized and critics loved to dogpile on. Mass Effect 3's redesign towards a war asset first design and Mass Effect Andromeda's total removal of alignments makes complete sense when you look at the problem in front of Bioware. The core mechanic of alignments, its flaws, they seem so fundamental that you may just want to give up and think, yeah, this is just old, right? If people hate it this much, it's not like we could save it. It's really no wonder that Bioware felt pressured to revise the alignment mechanics, and they were tempted into unwisely replacing them with a new core mechanic in Mass Effect 3, the whole war asset stuff. And it's also not a surprise that when it came time to reboot the franchise with Mass Effect Andromeda, it seemed pretty obvious to not even include the alignment mechanic in that game whatsoever. Even if, oops, this means the franchise reboot leaves out what makes the franchise a distinct IP. As someone who has spent a lot of time considering the problems here, I feel for Bioware. That said, we aren't Bioware back in 2010 through 2011 up to 2012, right? We have the benefit of years to reflect. We can look at both KOTOR and The Witcher 3 and take inspiration from them like Bioware never could. I mean, obviously The Witcher 3 wasn't even out when Bioware made these games. And by using KOTOR and The Witcher 3, we can tease out ideas that Bioware was trying to aim at with Mass Effect, at least it seems like they were trying to aim at, but they didn't necessarily hit that reliably. Once we think in terms of KOTOR and The Witcher 3, I think we start to see a lot of ways to solve these design problems, which actually have precedence within Mass Effect 1 and 2. Hell, it's not just that we can save the alignment mechanic, we can improve it. We can balance parts of KOTOR and The Witcher 3 in Mass Effect 3 to reliably deliver our target fantasy. The first flaw with the alignment mechanic was that players were sometimes given too much mechanical ability to influence the alignments of their crewmates. You know, in theory, we just need to limit players' agency so they can influence, but not fully dictate NPC alignments. Now, if we think about this in practice, I think this means that a sufficiently Paragon crewmate should not be willing to agree with a sufficiently Renegade choice, and vice versa. Indeed, a sufficiently Renegade choice should make a sufficiently Paragon crewmate oppose us as well, and again, the same in reverse. We should always be able to influence our crew's alignments, but only in plausible ways, right? So that means under normal circumstances, they should still be able to verbally oppose us if it makes sense. But in extreme moments, like dire circumstances, like critical turning points in the Reaper War, if we do things that Squadmates don't like, they're going to physically oppose us. If we're doing something that violates their way of life, their core ethical ideals, they shouldn't roll over and take it. So, generally speaking, under normal and extreme circumstances, this means that Squadmates should be acting more like Rex and Morden, and less like Jacob and Caden. Now, you may ask, how does this work? Well, again, generally in Mass Effect 3, I think we can imagine that things are going to play out kind of like they did with Garrus in Mass Effect 1. Because the amount we can influence Garrus in that game is very plausible. He's not our puppet. We can influence him with regard to his opinion on legal and institutional norms, but for obvious reasons, we can't make the Turian Garrus a committed human supremacist. So I think Mass Effect 3 should work rather similarly in that regard. Like, we should probably be able to influence, say, Garrus with regard to his opinion on the legal and institutional norms. Like maybe we have a choice where he commits to being a Spectre, or maybe the head of CSEC, I don't know. That's how it's going to work normally. Eventually there will be a crisis point, and imagine at that point that Shepard can finally mask off as a renegade once and for all, as a true human supremacist or a deep multicultural lover of aliens if they go full Paragon. Now, assuming if we went like renegade here, if we go the human supremacist route, we should expect Garrus to physically oppose us, and we'll smoke his ass to proceed. Those are the breaks. If you want to be a human supremacist, don't be surprised when alien squadmates rebel. Similarly, if we went the multicultural route instead, if we had human supremacist squadmates, they would naturally oppose us. Credit where it is due, stuff like this is something I think that Mass Effect 3 originally did very well. We end up more invested in the crisis moral dilemmas in that game because our squadmates are on the line. We care more about the Genophage dilemma because it's Rex and Morden, and we care more about the war on Rannoch because it's Tali and Legion. Fans loved these sequences because of these character sacrifices. It's no exaggeration to say these sequences are some of the most praised moments in the game. Indeed, the trilogy itself. Our fix, it looks at moments like these, and it takes them and it writes them around Paragon and Renegade alignments. And so that means when we hit moments like these, we're going to need to sacrifice some of our squadmates, because you really can't please everyone regardless of their ethical ideals. That's just more in keeping with our target fantasy. Now, some of you aren't going to like this change. That's why I started with this change. This is the one that I think is going to be the most controversial, because this change limits player agency. Some might prefer to keep all their squadmates very friendly, even if that violates their established characters. The argument here would basically go that it's better to have a lot of boring Jacobs and Cadens than dead friends, much less friends that we kill or that try to kill us. No one wakes up and says, gosh, I'd like to give myself an emotional gut punch betraying my friends, except when they're playing video games, I suppose. In principle, I think all of us can agree there is such a thing as influencing companions too much, to the point where it undermines our own experience as a player. We don't expect to convince Liara, Tali, Garrus, or Rex that human supremacy is good, or that Zaid should enlist in the Alliance, or even more wildly, that Jack should maybe consider going on a date with the elusive man. Because these characters' established convictions would make these ideas very silly. Players should be able to ethically influence crewmates, but not to ridiculous lengths. And I think we can all agree on that principle. If you accept this principle, I think there's really only two kinds of solutions. And you can see a range of options between them, but again, I think there's really only two fundamental kinds of solutions here. The first is that you could intentionally design squadmates to never have a reason to conflict with Shepard over ethical choices. This will result in a lot of squadmates that act a lot more like Caden and Jacob, and they're going to feel more forgettable, and they will be utterly disconnected to the game's moral dilemmas. So that's one option. And it's the option that it seems like Bioware took perhaps more than we would like, quite frankly. Now, the alternative option here is you can embrace the kind of change that I'm proposing and intentionally try to write squadmates more like Rex and Morden. They're going to feel highly memorable, and they're going to feel deeply involved in the moral dilemmas that you're engaging with. And I dare say it seems like this is overwhelmingly what the fan base prefers in their squadmates. So ultimately, you can either have forgettable sock puppets, or you can have squadmates that reason independent of you, but you can't have both. And I think it's actually quite clear what kind of game that most Mass Effect fans actually want. Ultimately, the cost of giving NPCs more agency is sacrificing a little bit of player agency. But I think once you realize what you're gaining, I think most people are going to be on board with the sacrifice, because players don't want the agency to make their story boring. They're always going to sacrifice this agency gladly. So ultimately, I think this first change that we've been discussing would really help Mass Effect 3 reliably deliver our target fantasy of choosing the moral of the story while getting wiser through pondering ethical dilemmas. We will now be more reliably invested in our alignment choices and their consequences, far more than ever before. Our squadmates' lives are now on the line. The second flaw with the old alignment mechanic was that it incentivizes you to exclusively commit to an alignment, and also to grind out all side missions whenever possible. In theory, to fix this, we just need to cut the incentives to prioritize side quests, as well as the incentives to commit to an alignment. This would free Mass Effect 3 up to more easily deliver on our target fantasy. Again, Mass Effect 3 deserves some credit for taking a stab at solving this problem. Mass Effect 3 cut the incentives to commit to an alignment. It sadly didn't cut the incentives to prioritize side quests, though. So, to be more precise, this is how it works. Whenever Shepard resolves certain quests or side quests, or makes Paragon or Renegade choices, they get this thing called the Reputation resource. If you have enough of the Reputation resource, you can unlock all the unique alignment choices. So, as long as you prioritize grinding enough side quests in Mass Effect 3, you're always going to be able to make whatever alignment choice you wish. Bioware was rightly proud of this improvement, and we can actually see that they felt this way as they noted it. There's a Patrick Weeks press release for Mass Effect 3 where he talks about this new dynamic. But the thing is, this new dynamic is still flawed. It's an improvement, but it's still flawed. You still have to adopt a mindless grind set. If you think about it, this change isn't anywhere near as big as BioWare's thought. Things are still playing out like they did in Mass Effect 1 and 2. In Mass Effect 3, if you haven't gotten enough reputation, it will indicate you are not allowed to make an alignment choice. You know, this, again, is not a bug. It was a feature. It was intended, because we can see Patrick Weeks noting this quite explicitly in the press release that I mentioned earlier. Key dialogue options at important moments in Mass Effect 3 are locked off. You can only take them if your reputation is high enough, and each of those lines marks a checkpoint. So if you see that you're a bit short of hitting a new line and someone has just said something like, "Let's head down to that person's homeworld and finish this once and for all," it's maybe worth your time to do a couple of side quests first, just to see if you can reach that line. In practice, this design means that if you don't prioritize doing enough side quests in Mass Effect 3, the Quarian Admirals, to give the example that Weeks is really referring to here, won't let you talk them into peace, even if you've made all the other requirements for that choice. You will not have the option to make the alignment choice if you haven't grinded stuff out yet. You will see that you don't have the option. And the end result here is, again, just like the prior games, if you're trying to play it safe, whenever you feel like the main narrative is gaining speed, it's time for you to prioritize side quests instead, to stop, start, stop, start. So, BioWare's Mass Effect 3 fix for this second flaw, it gets a lot more praise than it probably should. This hurry up and slow down dynamic wasn't fun in older games, nor is it fun in Mass Effect 3. Mass Effect 3 was absolutely moving in the right direction to solve this problem, but I don't think it fully understood it, and thus it didn't go all the way. It would be wiser just to remove all the restrictions on players' abilities to make Paragon and Renegade choices. It's needlessly restricted to lock choices either behind moral commitment or grinding enough reputation resources. And we know what this would look like. We know players would love it. The games occasionally actually embraced not putting restrictions on alignment choices. To give some examples, this is how Mass Effect 1 handles the choice about the fate of Zhu's Hope, as well as the fate of the Rachni Dilemma. This is also how every Paragon and Renegade interrupt works in Mass Effect 2, and this is also both how Mass Effect 1 and 2 conclude. In all of these moments, any Shepard, regardless of how many side quests they've grinded or how much they've committed to a moral path, can select any alignment choice. Any Shepard could save or slaughter the colonists of Zhu's Hope. Any Shepard could kill or spare the Rachni Queen. Any Shepard could save or kill the Council, and any Shepard could do any Paragon or Renegade interrupt. Any Shepard could save or destroy the Collector base. It's like Bioware knew, at some level, that key alignment choices were more fun if they were designed so that you could just do them if you thought they made sense. This is exactly how Mass Effect 3 should handle every single alignment choice. And this seems like the best possible fix to our problem here because it has oodles of precedent, and it very obviously serves our target fantasy quite well. Now, I guess you could argue against this fix that it's bad because it will make prioritizing side quests feel somewhat unnecessary, and it will allow Shepard to flip-flop between different alignments. Once again, I think only a minority of players would complain about this, though. Side quests, they're supposed to, by definition, be optional content. But because of perverse incentives, it can feel wise to prioritize them over the main quests in Mass Effect 1 and 2. So it's good to make side quests feel like side quests and not necessary priorities. I mean, even Casey Hudson, he also agrees on this point, at least in theory, even if Mass Effect often didn't live up to this idea in practice. There's this documentary about the making of Mass Effect 1 where Hudson rightly notes that what makes side quests most interesting and tempting for players to engage with is when you feel you don't have to do them. Done in this way, side quests enhance the player's feelings of agency and sense of depth about the universe. Here's the footage.
We always try to build in layers of depth, and so there's always the core story, and then we also have side plots. And part of the interest in the side plot is that you don't have to do it, which usually something that you don't have to do is therefore even more tempting. And with Mass Effect, we kind of took it even further, and then we actually added places on the map that are outside even the plots that you know about. Even if they're side plots, there's still other places for you to go. So again, it kind of adds to what you can do if you want to. But even if you choose not to do the additional side plots or go and explore the extra worlds and asteroids and things that are out there in the galaxy, it actually just makes the main story more interesting because you know that main story is set inside a larger galaxy. So just the fact that you can go past something and say, no, I'm not going to go there. I am going to stick to the main story. That little choice kind of reinforces the fact that you have freedom in this game.
Ultimately, when you must do side quests for extrinsic reasons, i.e. to unlock something in another game mechanic, it removes the intrinsic motivation to play them, changing them into a grind rather than an opportunity. And all the things that Casey Hudson just mentioned that side quests can do to enhance the role-playing stop occurring. So there should be no incentives to prioritize side quests. And very similarly, it's just better for our target fantasy if we give Shepard the ability to swap between alignments on the fly. People change their minds. Why can't Commander Shepard? Ultimately, this is why people love the freedom of the Paragon and Renegade interrupt in Mass Effect 2. This new mechanic was an excellent addition to the way alignments played out across the game. Allowing players to choose their alignments on a case-by-case basis, it's more fun and it's more realistic. The old dynamic rewarded foolish consistency. The new one will reward wise flexibility. The third flaw with the old alignment mechanic was how it restricted mixtures of moral attitudes. In theory, we need to allow more mixtures of the moral positions in each alignment, but keep the binary between them intact. Again, Mass Effect 1 can show us exactly how this could work. So, I like to think of this like a Russian nesting doll, because at the end of Mass Effect 1, there is an opportunity to get a choice inside of a choice. So at the end of the game, Renegades can sacrifice the Council while Paragons can save the Council. But here's where it gets interesting, because Renegades have the opportunity to clarify why they sacrificed the Council in a conversation with Udina or Anderson. This is the nested choice within the first choice. Renegades reveal they sacrificed the aliens to enable something like Udina's racial supremacist coup. Or they reveal they sacrificed the Council to confirm the kill on Sovereign, quietly enabling the return of a new multicultural and multiracial council. In effect, what you're getting here is one alignment choice that has another two alignment choices in it. As a result, players get to make an alignment choice that is more nuanced than any other in the entire game. I think this is the only time the trilogy ever did this, but I might be wrong. And I think this complex style of nested moral choices is exactly how all the most important alignment choices should work in Mass Effect 3. Now, I realize what the downside to this approach is. You can argue that it's going to be a lot of work. This is effectively going to quadruple the amount of ways that you can roleplay major alignment dilemmas. Now, I think this cost is worth it. Because first of all, you don't need to use this Russian nesting doll design for every alignment choice, just the major ones. Only say stuff like the conclusions in a main mission, not, any personal missions for crew or side quests on some planet or something. So that's going to limit the scope of where we're implementing this new, more complex design. But even then, this design, even if it is more work to implement, it is also quadrupling the player's narrative agency. So in gameplay, it's going to be obvious that this design feels very empowering. Players are going to have more chances than ever before to reason on a case-by-case basis and shape the moral of the story. You could start Paragon and then go Renegade within that Paragon. You can go Renegade and then go Paragon within it, or Renegade. You see what I mean? You see the options? And what could be more appropriate than to embrace real branching right now in Mass Effect 3, the end of the trilogy? So this Russian nesting doll change would give us so many more nuanced choices and so much more control over the moral of the story, and that is our target fantasy. A change like this is going to make Mass Effect 3 feel faithful to, but way superior to Mass Effect 1 and 2. We'd be getting the fantasy that Mass Effect 1 and 2 teased us with, but lacked the means to sustain. The fourth flaw with the old alignment mechanic was how it restricted mixtures of personality and moral opinions. In theory, we need to allow for more mixtures of personality and morality while keeping the binary intact. An elegant way to do this would be by cutting personality choices from the alignment mechanic while keeping those choices in the game. In short, you're still going to be making the familiar old personality choices. You could still be intimidating or charming as appropriate in the conversation, but that wouldn't be presented to the player as an alignment choice. So there'd no longer be a default Paragon or Renegade personality limiting your freedom as Shepard. This would help our target fantasy by removing a design idea that limited our moral imagination. So I think the argument against this fix is that this is going to make Mass Effect 3 feel perhaps too much unlike prior games. Because it is true that prior games, the most common way that you get Paragon and Renegade points, it's through the little personality choices and all sorts of dialogues. They're very low stakes, and that's why it's easy to rack them up there. So if we removed the idea of personality choices being about alignment choices, it would be noticeable that we've done that. And some people, I think, I could see why you might initially fear, oh, doesn't this mean we've changed Paragons and Renegades a lot? Haven't we cut something core out of the game? Yes and no, and mostly no. The player only needed to grind personality choices to get alignment points to begin with to make the restrictions on alignment choices something they didn't have to deal with. You only wanted to do lots of little personality choices committed to one alignment to unlock important moral choices later. But we already eliminated that dynamic earlier with our previous fix. So we've already gotten rid of the need to grind alignment points. And that means you don't need to make alignment choices as personality choices anymore. So if we make it so that you still have the personality choices, but they're not alignment choices, it's not really going to negatively impact the player's role-playing. Alignment choices, they're still going to feel like they're defined by the old moral viewpoints, so they're still going to feel very similar, but now you're going to be free to combine whatever personality you want as it makes sense. So, you know, Paragons and Renegades, they're still going to feel like the classic moral exemplars that you're expecting. You're still going to be making libertarian or human supremacist choices as a renegade, and you're still going to be making authoritarian or multicultural choices as a Paragon. You're just going to get much more interesting combinations of personality with these options. You know, much like a real person dealing with different circumstances, being nice to someone or not so nice to this person depending upon what makes sense, rather than a Jedi or Sith committed to some sort of metaphysical personality based in the world and the Force. Fun for KOTOR, not for Mass Effect. So I think our fix here, it's easy and it's liberating. It's low effort, low risk, high reward. It's going to seem like Mass Effect has offered the player more options if you implement this, but it doesn't actually require the devs to do more work per se. You won't need to write more choices or record more dialogue, right? You just get to use that existing content in more ways, which will enhance the player's sense of freedom. We're effectively using existing content in a way that is more creative and resource efficient. In effect, a renegade can now intimidate on command, but they could also turn on the charm. Similarly, a Paragon could be the unflappable diplomat we've come to expect, but they could also act intimidating as well. You could treat people the way you thought was appropriate, with no gamey restriction on it. This change creates a more realistic and nuanced role-playing dynamic which better simulates our real social lives. And, you know, thinking way back to that interview from Hudson, that was always kind of the goal with the alignment mechanic at some level, was that it would capture some of that realistic nuance. And so ultimately, I think this fix is another critical one if we want Mass Effect 3 to reliably hit our target fantasy. The fifth flaw was that the alignment mechanic had an ingredient about sacrifice which was inconsistently implemented, and that often made renegades seem foolish or sociopathic. There's really only one way to fix this kind of problem. You know, first we start by cutting anything that's making it impossible to implement our design consistently. Then with a revised recipe, we implement the design consistently. And I think that means we should probably cut the alignment ingredient about sacrifices. Let me be clear what I mean by that. What I mean is that there should not be alignment dilemmas focused on sacrificing or saving lives in Mass Effect 3. I'm not saying that we won't need to sacrifice some people's lives. What I'm saying is that both alignments should need to make sacrifices sometimes. This would make them differ in terms of the ends, why they're making sacrifices, not in terms of their means, like, do I sacrifice or not? And here's the thing, we don't need to invent a new way for this to work. Our first fix takes care of this problem. Because, you know, during certain crisis moments, either alignment will now need to sacrifice certain squadmates to proceed. This would cause dramatic story consequences every player would notice immediately. Most obvious thing here, there's no longer going to be an option to get away with saving everybody's lives instead of sacrificing some. You're going to feel this immediately as a Paragon player. Paragon choices, they're just not going to be the get-out-of-jail-free card they used to be. And by the same token, renegade choices are no longer going to seem foolish or sociopathic as they once did. Ultimately, I think this kind of change, it really makes sense for Mass Effect 3 because Mass Effect 2's ending promised that the Reapers are invading in Mass Effect 3. And it's just very implausible to hope that Shepard will win a war without sacrificing lives. All wars require the sacrifice of some lives. So players are going to be expecting to make alignment choices about sacrificing lives in a war in Mass Effect 3. That's what they're going to be expecting going in. And naturally, the most emotionally significant lives to put in the player's hands, it's those beloved squadmates. Now, I realize that this fix isn't going to excite some people like it's exciting me. It's probably going to piss some people off. Because if you don't let players make Paragon choices where they can save everyone like a messiah, or Renegade choices where they sacrifice everyone like a Sith, Mass Effect 3 is going to feel different than prior games. But what's the alternative solution to the problem in front of us? We've already seen that Mass Effect 1 and 2 were not consistent about what the best outcome was. They couldn't be, insofar as they wanted to make outcomes seem equally interesting, but were also committed to the idea that one alignment was good and the other evil. This awkward mix of KOTOR and The Witcher 3 that we've been exploring this whole time. So, given that, there was just no way to consistently develop the old ideas about what sacrifices were worth it or not without some kind of change like ours. I mean, either you cut the idea that we're sacrificing lives at any point from gameplay wholesale, or you make some kind of change like ours where we just create new rules for it, and it would obviously seem to make sense to do that with alignments, because that is the core gameplay mechanic. Ultimately, the Jack Bauer versus Captain Kirk concept that inspired this idea about sacrifice was an incoherent mess, and a game designer can't consistently implement inconsistency. When you try to do that, you end up with a very KOTOR-style role-playing fantasy, one where the Paragon alignment is morally and practically superior to the Renegade at all times. So again, I don't see what alternative we really have here. We either cut the idea of making sacrifice entirely out of a game about war, or we make it clearly integrated with the core role-playing mechanic of alignments, which would seem to indicate the consequence that certain alignment choices will result in the sacrifice of some people, and the most interesting people are our squadmates, right? Ultimately, this fix, it's probably going to be very welcome to the Renegade players and not very welcome to the Paragon players. But I think that's a surface way of looking at it, because I think even the Paragons and Renegades will both like this once you sit down and think about it. Because this fix encourages moral reasoning, and I think that's our target fantasy. It doesn't let you mindlessly select Paragon without thinking and then pat you on the back for turning your brain off and just committing to choosing one color again and again. Our fix makes it so that you're going to be thinking beyond just good and evil in that sense, and feeling like you're getting wisdom in the process. In a crisis, you're going to make alignment choices that sacrifice ideologically opposed squadmates. That's going to be emotionally devastating, but that's not a bug. That's not actually a bad thing. That's a feature of this change. Frankly, you're going to feel far more Paragon when you make Paragon choices now, and far more Renegade when you make Renegade choices now. Because now you're choosing alignments for their own sake, not because one is the more optimal play style from a moral or mechanical perspective. Again, I may be wrong on this, but my gut says most players want to be provoked into strong feelings and tricky dilemmas. I don't think most players want to be bulldozed into selecting one option again and again and again. If most players want to feel that there are distinct consequences for their choices that are equally interesting, sacrificing some squadmates' lives is the answer. I think Mass Effect 1 and 2, their most memorable moments already show that this is a great idea. Those games used our squadmates' fates to make us deeply care about the dilemmas in front of us. That's how Virmire works, and that's how the suicide mission works, and that's why these are some of the high points in the first two games, because the lives of our squadmates are up for grabs. Our choices really feel like they matter here. And how could it be any other way? At the end of the day, the fate of the galaxy, it's not really emotionally real to us. What is emotionally real to us is the fate of our fictional friends. We only care about the fictional galaxy because of the people in it. So choices that put the lives of our friends at risk, they're always going to be the most impactful to a player in this kind of game. Stopping the Reapers, it's never going to be an impactful climax, in the same way that sacrificing a crewmate is. The most emotionally impactful way to win the war against the Reapers, it's by sacrificing some of our crew. So even if the idea of needing to lose some squadmates may seem deeply emotionally unpalatable on first glance, I think on reflection, this idea is one that enough Mass Effect players would prefer. There's plenty of precedent for this fix, and it notably enhances the fantasy we've been targeting with all of our fixes. So you're still going to make sacrifices in service to your ideals. They're just going to be consistently defined sacrifices now. You're not sacrificing things for the sake of sacrificing anymore, or saving things for the sake of saving things, not that boring good and evil. You're going to be picking reasons as to why you're sacrificing this versus that. And so in crisis moments, your squad mates' lives, they're going to hang in the balance as a result of your alignment choices. I think this change will make for Mass Effect 3 that feels like it pays off what the prior game set up without repeating the old Venetian mistakes. You're going to get more gut punches and less dilemmas, which aren't really dilemmas. You're going to feel like you need to make wise choices while still having control over the moral of the story. The sixth flaw was that renegade choices made your avatar gain facial scars, while Paragon choices make them unblemished. Initially, I thought the solution here was rather obvious, and I was quite pleased with myself about that. You see, you could try to flip the mechanic on its head here, and make it work for our target fantasy. Here's how that would work. So rather than it being the case that renegade choices gave you scars, you could have it so that both Paragon and renegade choices give you a different color of scar. A person who only made Paragon choices would get these increasingly nasty blue scars over time, whereas a person that made lots of renegade choices would get increasingly nasty red scars over time. This would immediately visually signal to the player that partisan moral commitment is what we see as evil in this game, and that a good player avatar is the one making an equal mixture of Paragon and renegade choices. And that seems to serve our target fantasy, right? It promotes moral reasoning for its own sake, doesn't it? No, it doesn't. This fix creates again the very problem it tried to address. Instead of incentivizing you to mindlessly play Paragon, this fix encourages you to mindlessly select both alignments equally over time. And that also isn't what we want. We want players to make choices intrinsically, for their own sake, because they think it's what's right, without some other game mechanic extrinsically motivating them to play differently. The carrot and stick of facial scar mechanics is just fundamentally at odds with our target fantasy. So we should probably cut this mechanic wholesale. Ignoring the fact that this mechanic is a reductive take on beauty and ugliness, its fatal flaw is that there's no way to implement this mechanic in any revised form without it undermining our target fantasy. It provides an extrinsic incentive to stop morally reasoning for its own sake. It effectively corrupts our motives, because if you want me to make choices on their own merits, you can't have another game mechanic incentivizing me to do something else. There's just no way to tweak this mechanic without fixing its fatal flaw, and that means that we need to cut it. This mechanic created a KOTOR fantasy which undermined Mass Effect. But we have no reason to think that if we cut this mechanic, players will riot and say, oh, this doesn't feel like Mass Effect. Remember, Mass Effect 1 didn't have the facial scars mechanic. It did just fine without this new design idea in Mass Effect 2. And that immediately begs the question, why was this new mechanic added in Mass Effect 2? Maybe Mass Effect 2 added this to intentionally make things feel like we were hitting the KOTOR vibe. That seems very implausible, right? Given all we've seen from Bioware's creatives. So I suspect the reason that Mass Effect 2 added this scarring mechanic was that it might seem to make our choices feel more impactful, like they have meaningfully different outcomes because there's visual evidence of there being different outcomes on our face all the time. In other words, I suspect this mechanic was added to respond to the criticisms that people had about Mass Effect 1's alignments feeling restrictive or somewhat indistinct in their consequences sometimes. The thing is, though, if I'm, Johnny Player here, and I don't feel alignment choices matter because they have a lot of problems with them that makes them feel somewhat indistinct sometimes or unclear or restrictive. So I'm Johnny Player, I've got this complaint, and you change my avatar's face because I done one thing and I do another, that isn't going to help me feel better. If something is making me feel that Mass Effect 1's alignment mechanics aren't impactful enough, the solution to that problem isn't changing my face. That's just going to exacerbate the problems that we've seen with Mass Effect 1's alignment mechanics. The solution, it's frankly the ones that we've been considering all throughout this. Rather than a cosmetic band-aid, you need to get into the nitty-gritty of what your alignment mechanics are trying to do and how you can serve that exact fantasy, which, as we've seen, Bioware struggled to do. So ultimately, it was a mistake that Mass Effect 2 added this scarring mechanic, and we need to cut it for Mass Effect 3 if we want Mass Effect 3 to reliably deliver on our target fantasy. The seventh problem with the alignment mechanic was that it incentivized nearly 92% of players to make Paragon and not Renegade choices. Now, all of our previous changes should help fix this. We've already removed incentives to stick to one alignment with our second and third fix, and incentives to go Paragon rather than Renegade with our fourth, fifth, and sixth fix. So far, so good. Otherwise, I think we just need to remind our writers to ensure that Paragon and Renegade choices seem similarly practical and just, especially if that deeply offends their own ethical sensibilities. You need to still try to write them as if they could be equally practical and just. At the same time, we should probably also remind the writers exactly what we define as Paragon and Renegade choices. In other words, this means the writer should be trying to create dilemmas where the Paragon's authoritarian ideals seem unjust compared to the Renegade's libertarian ideals, and vice versa. For the same reasons, sometimes it should seem like human supremacy is superior to multiculturalism, and vice versa. If you fully embrace this new design, it will make it not obvious to players what the meta choice is, which is going to inspire them to reason more often. And eventually they will learn that, unlike in Mass Effect 1 and 2, Mass Effect 3 doesn't offer meta choices anymore. And all of that is going to dramatically reduce the likelihood that 92% of players are going to play the game in just one way, turning their brain off. I understand that even if you think we're aiming at the right target fantasy with all of our changes, that there's still alternative ways to solve the issues I've raised. I've tried to point out the costs of my fixes, some which might not be worth paying for some, and for similar reasons I've sought fixes with design precedent in the game, so we can infer without playtesting if they would fit with our target fantasy. Finally, I tried to give mutually reinforcing solutions, solving multiple issues at once and improving multiple things at once. If a fix can reinforce other fixes, I think it's a sign that our proposed package of changes are optimized for our target fantasy overall. It's a sign we're not making piecemeal changes that actually make things worse, like Mass Effect 2 adding facial scars. Finally, I've also tried to show why I thought someone would dislike my changes by explaining what fantasy my changes effectively hinder. Overwhelmingly, it hinders a game that is mostly KOTOR or mostly The Witcher, because I've been trying to hit that balance, right? Ideally, you'd want to playtest proposed fixes until the best solutions became clear in gameplay. Still, I think our fixes are probably a very good starting point and definitely aim in the right direction. That said, I'd wager the way we've diagnosed problems that's very close to hitting the bullseye itself. Because the problems we diagnosed ultimately are causing Mass Effect to generate a frustrating mix of fantasies, an inconsistent and unharmonious combination of a fantasy somewhere between KOTOR and The Witcher 3. You often feel like Mass Effect 1 and 2 don't know what target fantasy they were aiming at, and based on everything we've seen from the developers at Bioware, it seems like they didn't actually know. And ultimately, that is a problem that you do need to solve with any redesign, whether it's aiming at our target fantasy or a different target fantasy. The problems with the alignment mechanic are problems, even if you want different solutions and different outcomes. On balance, the design I'm proposing is therefore going to feel very faithful to the prior games, but I think it's also going to feel superior to them. Nothing's going to be missing that players think absolutely should be there, but everything is going to feel less restrictive and far more empowering now. In this chart, we can quickly review the problems and solutions that we've identified. Cumulatively, I think this means that our 7 fixes will make a profound difference. Any one of them would be a noticeable upgrade for players. All of them at once are going to feel like an unmistakable improvement. Together, these fixes make for a nuanced, realistic, and consistent experience. They're also relatively low risk in light of all the design precedent that most of these fixes have. All in all, our proposed redesign enhances the strengths but responds to the weaknesses of Mass Effect 1 and 2. Our fixes would help make Mass Effect 3 not deliver a Venetian KOTOR role-playing experience, and it would better hit the balance between KOTOR and The Witcher 3. You know, you'd be getting an experience which is all about alignments, but isn't about good and evil, while you're choosing the moral of the story and feel like you're getting wiser at the same time. So, just so we don't lose sight of what we've done in terms of the narrative focus of the alignment mechanic, like what it means to make an alignment choice in this game, here's a diagram showing the ingredients in our new revised alignment mechanic. This diagram is, in essence, our new design recipe for Mass Effect 3. Personality choices aren't a part of alignments anymore, and neither is making sacrifices or saving lives for their own sake. Alignments now focus narratively on different ways of achieving justice and ending racial conflict. Wherever players have major choices in Mass Effect 3, these major choices should use both these ingredients, or at least one. Presumably, the minor choices throughout the game should only use just one of these ingredients, whether we're talking about a side quest or maybe even personal missions for our squad mates. But again, we really want our major moments to try to lean into the branching here, and to ideally use both these ingredients in the Russian nesting doll style that we've been exploring. You may have noticed that I opted for a rather conservative redesign across the board. I changed less than I could have. Indeed, I tried to change as little as I possibly could while still hitting my target. A more adventurous designer would have been more experimental and aggressive with the alignment mechanics. In the end, that would have dictated a rewrite of Mass Effect 3 with more thematic complexity, and different moral dilemmas than what returning players would expect. I think you could make this more aggressive kind of redesign, in that it would be a great idea for future Mass Effect games, but Mass Effect 3 itself would suffer from such an aggressive series of design changes. Because Mass Effect 3, it's the third act in a self-conscious trilogy, which means that it needs to err on the side of caution in making design changes. Too large of a change sets the story up to disappoint the prior ones. You know, I've covered this subject actually at some length in a different video. You know, there I mentioned how the design changes with Mass Effect 3, namely the new focus on the war asset mechanics, set the game up to disappoint. Ultimately, I was chastened by the example of Bioware going too far with their redesign, and so I chose to risk changing too little with mine instead. Too much of a change is just going to generate disappointment for returning players. Mass Effect 3 needs to develop and conclude the kind of alignment dilemmas that Mass Effect 1 and 2 trains the player to expect. At this point, I hope I've shown that the idea of alignment-based mechanics for a game are not outdated in the way that I think they so are often seen. The execution was really the problem with the Mass Effect games because it targeted incompatible fantasies. You know, you can't have The Witcher 3 if you're playing in a universe with a light and dark side, and you can't have KOTOR if you're making a grab bag of ethical choices like Geralt, which don't really fit into a set of explicit moral alignments. But you can combine the fantasy of authoring a story with the fantasy of slowly acquiring wisdom. You know, it really doesn't matter what game franchise we're talking about. If you mix incompatible fantasies, you'll have a problem. So it's not really the alignment mechanics that are the issue here, it's a lack of clarity conceptually on the developer's part about these games. And I think this is why you could make even more fundamental changes to alignments in future Mass Effects. Future Mass Effects, they aren't beholden to the expectations of Mass Effect 1 and 2. They aren't the third act in trilogy needing to pay off the prior games. Future games, more debates than libertarianism versus authoritarianism or human supremacy versus multiculturalism, more things than these could additionally define what it means to be a Paragon and Renegade. You could add new alignment debates about, say, history, religion, types of government, the nature of personhood, how we should think about forgiveness, and so on. So long as you focus on things that seem somehow equally morally plausible under different circumstances, the sky is really the limit in terms of how you could design different types of alignment dilemmas. And let's not stop right here. This is essentially a form and content distinction. As long as you have the form of alignments, the content can be changed. You can even change the name of them in that sense, right? You could come up with a new name for alignments. You don't need to call them Paragon and Renegade if you're going to use alignment mechanics. As we've seen, it's not like those words implied anything definite to begin with. In hindsight, it would obviously be very helpful for the designers and writers if alignments were given names that were more evocative of their actual contents. Bioware made it hard to understand alignments by using words which said so little about them, but future Mass Effect style inspired games, they don't have to repeat that mistake. They can do better, I just love changes like these in future games, especially because I just struggle to sympathize with the Renegades' belief in human supremacy. I've had to stomach a fair amount of my own moral repulsion while rewriting Mass Effect 3 because I'm obligated to make this moral idea seem semi-reasonable for the player, because that's how Mass Effect 1 and 2 worked. Personally, I just feel like the Paragon's belief in multiculturalism is good, and the Renegades' belief in human supremacy makes them bad. But Mass Effect, it just doesn't seem to know what it thinks on this subject. On the one hand, I do feel that Bioware, they really wanted me to get the impression I did, that one is good and the other is bad, a la KOTOR. Because human supremacy gets criticized by the overwhelming amount of NPCs in this setting, whether human or alien. Even Ashley Williams is out there criticizing terra firma and Cerberus. So there's a lot of lore in Mass Effect showing that multiculturalism is the pragmatic and moral way of the future. But on the other hand, at the same time, I also feel like Bioware wanted me to feel like there's an actual ethical debate to be had here. And it kind of makes sense because Mass Effect, just like The Witcher, race is a biological fact in these games. It's not a social construct as it is in our actual real world. And that's why the Mass Effect's in-game codex treats race as a biological difference that incites conflict. It's the whole idea between the Rachni and the Krogan and all these different conflicts. And that's even the idea of why synthetics are going up against organics, because there's this implicit ideal of racial tension between them. Anyway, it's just clear there's a lot of lore in Mass Effect that's very interested in the idea that multiculturalism is just way too idealistic and doomed to fail. So Mass Effect 1 and 2 are kind of a contradiction. They're sort of a mess on these points. They don't really know what they're trying to say about multiculturalism versus human supremacy. Ultimately, the way I make sense of this mess is that, it seems to be a consequence of Bioware failing to define exactly what they meant by Paragon and Renegade and exactly what they wanted out of their alignment mechanics and story, what was the fantasy they wanted to offer. And as a result, we get incompatible KOTOR and The Witcher 3 ideas about multiculturalism and human supremacy. They seem to have started at Bioware with a Star Trek-y and classic sci-fi idea about human supremacy and multiculturalism, and then they tried to portray the debate between these views as reasonable, but also as one with a right side. You just can't do those things at the same time, and that's how you get a lot of world building, which validates and invalidates both perspectives in a very awkward way. It's very clear that I chose not to resolve this tension either way in my proposed redesign, and I did that because I didn't want to set Mass Effect 3 up to feel too different from the prior games. That contradiction was just inherent to Mass Effect 1 and 2, and I feel that Mass Effect 3 just has to inherit certain narrative and design choices from the prior games if it's going to feel like a natural conclusion to them. But obviously, it would be preferable to not so awkwardly mix KOTOR and The Witcher 3 design ideas like this in future Mass Effect-inspired games. You shouldn't depict a debate about a thing where there's, two reasonable positions, but also one side is right. That fails to offer a coherent mixture of the fantasies we can get from KOTOR and The Witcher 3, the thing that's so unique to Mass Effect. All this means that redesigning alignments in these more substantive ways could work not just fine, but arguably much better. Changing their contents and names can really improve things. And doing so, future Mass Effect games could better hit our target fantasy, which mixes certain parts of KOTOR and The Witcher 3. Like heck, you could even create a new trilogy of Mass Effect style games run a new set of alignments with new names, and it would still feel very faithful to the franchise. You could even multiply the amount of alignment viewpoints, the amount of moral debates inside it, by a substantial amount to create even more moral nuance. And you wouldn't end up sacrificing the ability of the player to feel like they're getting wiser and also select the moral of the story. Indeed, so long as the players feel like they control the moral of the story and are supposed to morally reason, they're going to feel like they're playing Mass Effect, whether or not they're actually playing as Commander Shepard. You know, again, the form versus content distinction. That's why I think the debate in the fandom at time of recording about whether Shepard should come back for the next 2 games, it's actually just a total waste of everyone's time, focusing on the wrong thing. Commander Shepard was just an avatar for expressing the alignment mechanics. So what future Mass Effects need to feel faithful to the spirit of the past is more alignment mechanics. More or less, Shepard is irrelevant. Shepard is, again, the contents. We don't need to confuse the contents with the form. You can have alignment mechanics without Shepard, without calling them Paragon and Renegade, and without them being the exact same things they once were. But if you don't have alignment choices in some form or the other, it won't feel like Mass Effect. Even if we are playing as Shepard again, if we don't have those choices, it's just not going to feel like it's Mass Effect. I don't think it's an accident that the Mass Effects which downplayed or cut alignments are so controversial. Mass Effect 3 focused on war assets, while Mass Effect Andromeda focused on viability mechanics. And there's a lot of differences between these games, but, you know, the big similarity is that neither of them tell stories which focus on alignment choices. That's not what they're mechanically or narratively about. In the end, both of these games, they're all about making ambiguous choices, very aggressively Witcher 3 style, and also that all calculate towards one number. Yeah, in different ways, Mass Effect 3 and Mass Effect Andromeda are good on their own terms, but they're arguably not aiming at what this IP is in its heart and soul. Future Mass Effect-inspired games, they need improved alignment mechanics. Our redesign is just one way to start thinking about what the possibilities the future could hold on this subject. Alignments aren't outdated, contrary to popular opinion. They were just abandoned in their infancy unwisely, and they have a bad reputation because people misunderstand what they were trying to do. I'd say the future here is actually bright in terms of the possibilities, in terms of improving this mechanic. Ultimately, love them or hate them, the alignment mechanics are the key part of what makes Mass Effect a unique brand. They're a mechanic that's ideally suited to help players reason about the moral of their story. I mean, think about what they do. At their best, they categorize the types of moral dilemmas the story will constantly be presenting for you, but they also don't make it easy for you to choose amongst them. And that lets the player engage in very tricky moral dilemmas with an unusual amount of moral clarity. You know, this is so great. You end up like a character in a Platonic dialogue. The alignment mechanics, they're there to help you find what you believe in. They act kind of like Socrates, but you still need to determine what you think the nature of justice and morality is. Meanwhile, the universe responds to your ethical imagination with high romance and epic drama. There's always going to be a market for games like this, and there's going to be an opportunity for those ambitious enough to make games like them. Few games have hoped to offer this unique fantasy to players. Mass Effect was one of the first to try, and there's no reason to think that the future won't be filled with better Mass Effect-inspired games. To summarize this video, it was my intention to show you how you could redesign Mass Effect 3 to improve its alignment mechanics using something inspired by Mass Effect 1 and 2. I've done this partly because I think this is the only way to solve the kinds of problems that people have with Mass Effect 3. And I've also done this because I think the future of the franchise is at stake here. We've seen what happens when Mass Effect tries to abandon the old alignment mechanics. It loses its reason to exist, and it looks like a pale reflection of itself, failing to live up to its old glory. Mass Effect, it's at its best when it tries to balance design ideas that we can recognize in The Witcher 3 and KOTOR. We want a mixture of moral clarity and moral ambiguity without sacrificing either one of these things. We don't want more fan-base splitting games like Mass Effect 3 and Mass Effect Andromeda, much less more Mass Effect 1 and 2 style stuff with an incoherent design undermining them. While I've focused on showing how you could specifically improve Mass Effect 3's alignment mechanics, I've also indicated how you could take my changes even further in future games. Future Mass Effects can make even more aggressive changes to hit our target fantasy. Indeed, other developers than Bioware could take these ideas and run with them. It's not like any developer owns the concept of wisdom, moral reasoning, moral clarity, or moral ambiguity. There's room for many more games here inspired by Mass Effect, whether they are just spiritual successors to Mass Effect, or if they actually have Mass Effect in the title and they're made by Bioware. You know, if Bioware can't refine their unique legacy, the thing they gave birth to, some other developer, they're surely going to do it instead. Still, it's one thing to talk about this in theory though, right? It can be quite hard to imagine what my design changes would look like in practice. My ideas might seem impractical to some until they have expression in a more concrete game form. And that's why my next video will be a full rewrite of Mass Effect 3 using my redesign to guide it. You know, I'm not promising perfection here, but I think I can promise something that's more faithful to the prior games than Mass Effect 3 was. So, if you live in this glorious future and I finish this rewrite, I'll link to it right here, right now. You know, I'm jealous of you future people because I've got a lot of blood, sweat, and tears of editing ahead of me. And if we aren't in this future yet, that means that you, yes you, could help me make this future happen. There's a reason why you can't currently find full rewrites of Mass Effect 3 on YouTube, why this is a genre that people don't produce content in. It is a brutally difficult task. It is one thing to say that you want a different game, or even just rewrite the ending itself. It's a whole other thing to commit to writing a full story rewrite and outline that reacts to all major alignment choices and gives new ones with branching endings. That's no small task. There's a reason why Bioware employed a team of writers to tackle different parts of their games. It is just an act of hubris to try and rewrite something like this on your own. So I need my own team to provide feedback on stuff like main missions and missions for Squadmates and the alignment choices therein. If you've listened this far, you might be the right kind of person for this team. Because a writer like me, we're only as good as we are at taking feedback, and that means that we need people to give us excellent feedback, and heck, I'm going to need a lot of feedback on this one. My existing writing and feedback partners, they're not going to be sufficient for a scope like this project, which is wild. So if you want to provide feedback on what I'm producing for my rewrite of Mass Effect 3, please fill out the survey in the description. Right now I have most of the beginning, middle, and end written. And so, you know, I would like to refine all that, but I think the big task in terms of new creation is creating personal missions for each of the squad mates with interesting Paragon and Renegade endings that sort of reflect their character arcs as they've sort of been established in Mass Effect 1 and 2. So there's still quite a lot that you could be influencing me on here, and I would certainly appreciate the thoughtful feedback of anyone listening. You know, to wrap it all up, you know, otherwise, if you're still here, you know, consider funding my Patreon. Obviously, hey, you know, if you just want to like and subscribe, comment, share, that also helps me out quite a bit. And look, I just appreciate you taking the time to watch this video and think about the future of Mass Effect with me. Thanks for watching if you've made it this far. I really do appreciate it, but I should go. If you're still here looking for some recommendations on video essays, I've got you covered. I'm going to recommend 3 different video essays by John Wolfe at the channel Superdude. The first video I'd recommend is Tears of the Kingdom, What Was Gained and What Was Lost. If you're interested in thinking more about how a game can make changes to deliver a similar but different fantasy, this one's for you. This video explores the different fantasies that Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom seem to offer. If you're trying to articulate why you preferred part or whole of either of these recent Zelda games, I particularly recommend this video. The next video I'd recommend is Dungeons & Dragons Across Mediums. If you're a fan of Mass Effect, I suspect you're someone who would enjoy tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons, which served as a kind of inspiration for video games like Mass Effect. This video by Super Dude explores things that video games inspired by D&D can do well that TTRPGs struggle to. Ultimately, it's a comparison of Dungeons & Dragons, Baldur's Gate, and Honor Among Thieves, that more recent D&D movie. The last video is easily my favorite among the ones this channel has put out. It's Fire Emblem Story vs. Tactics. This video explores how the recent Fire Emblem games have both succeeded and failed at integrating their story and gameplay. I love this video. It's a video I probably would have wanted to make if John Wolfe hadn't saved me the effort of making it himself. If you care about Fire Emblem or Mass Effect, I think there's interesting ideas here to consider. Indeed, I've taken inspiration from Fire Emblem Three Houses in my rewrite of Mass Effect 3. Byleth's routes inspired my idea that ideologically opposed Squadmates should conflict with Shepard in different runs of your game. And those are all my recommendations. So be well, and hope to see you in the next video.